In the year 865, on a gray morning when the North Sea churned beneath a sky the color of bruised iron, a fleet of longships appeared on the eastern horizon of England. There were so many of them that later chroniclers would abandon all attempts at precise counting and simply call it what it was: the Great Heathen Army. Hundreds of square sails, each one stitched with the crude geometry of war, pushed westward by a bitter autumn wind. The keels of the leading ships cut through the shallows off the coast of East Anglia, and when the first iron-helmed warriors leaped into the surf and waded ashore, they carried with them something more dangerous than their axes, more devastating than fire. They carried a grudge, a blood debt. The sons of a dead man had come to collect what they believed England owed them. And what England owed them, they said, was everything. The leader of this invasion force, if the Sagas can be trusted, was a man who could not walk. Ivar, called the Boneless, was carried onto English soil on a shield borne by 4 warriors, his legs twisted and useless beneath him, his mind sharper than any blade in the army. Beside him stood his brothers, Halfdan, whose name would be carved into the political landscape of northern England for generations. Sigurd called Snake in the Eye for the strange serpentine mark said to circle the pupil of his left eye, and Ubba, whose battle standard bore the image of a raven that Norse women had woven in a single afternoon with magic threaded into every stitch. These men commanded perhaps the largest Scandinavian military force ever to reach British shores. They did not come for plunder, though plunder would follow. They did not come for land, though land they would seize. They came, every source agrees, for vengeance. Their father, they claimed, had been murdered, thrown alive into a pit of venomous snakes by Ælla, the king of Northumbria. And as the venom ate through his flesh and his body convulsed on the cold stone floor of that pit, their father was said to have spoken his last words with a terrible smile. Words that would ring across the centuries of Norse storytelling like the peal of a funeral bell. How the little piglets would grunt, he said, if they knew what the old boar suffers. The old boar's name was Ragnar Lothbrok. And those little piglets had grown into something far worse than swine. What happened next would reshape the political geography of England, shatter the power of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and set in motion events that would lead directly to the establishment of the Danelaw, a vast swathe of eastern and northern England governed by Scandinavian law and Scandinavian lords. Within 2 years of their landing, Ivar and his brothers would capture York, execute King Ælla in a manner so gruesome that it has haunted historical debate for a millennium, and bring the most powerful kingdom in England, Northumbria, to its knees. Within a decade, they would threaten the very existence of Anglo-Saxon civilization, stopped only by the desperate genius of a young king named Alfred, who would earn the title Great precisely because of how close the sons of Ragnar brought him to annihilation. All of this is documented. The Great Heathen Army is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in Frankish annals, in Irish records, in the very soil of England where archaeologists continue to unearth the physical evidence of its passage. The sons are real. The invasion is real. The vengeance motive appears in sources close enough to the events to carry genuine weight. But the father, the old boar himself, the man whose murder supposedly launched this apocalypse, Ragnar Lothbrok, the most famous Viking who ever lived, the dragon slayer, the sacker of Paris, the husband of shield maidens, the king of Denmark and Sweden, the man whose name has been spoken more times in the 21st century than perhaps any other figure of the early medieval world. This man may never have existed at all. And that single uncertainty opens a chasm beneath everything we think we know about the Viking Age. The sources that tell us about Ragnar Lothbrok are numerous, vivid, and deeply contradictory. They span 5 centuries, multiple languages, and at least 3 distinct literary traditions, and they agree on almost nothing except the broadest outlines of the legend. To understand Ragnar, we must first understand the fractured mirror through which we see him. a mirror made of parchment and ink, oral tradition and political propaganda, poetry and plain fabrication. The earliest potential reference to a figure who might be Ragnar appears in the Frankish Annals of Saint-Bertin, a chronicle maintained by monks in the monastery of Saint-Bertin in northern Francia. Under the year 845, the annals record that a Viking fleet of approximately 120 ships sailed up the Seine River, led by a Norse chieftain, whom the monks called Ragnar. This Ragnar extracted an enormous ransom from the Frankish king Charles the Bald, 7,000 pounds of silver, a sum so staggering that it represented a significant fraction of the entire Frankish treasury. The fleet withdrew after receiving payment, and Ragnar himself reportedly died shortly afterward of a dysentery-like illness, which the Frankish chroniclers interpreted with undisguised satisfaction as divine punishment for his sacrilege. The name Ragnar is linguistically compatible with the Old Norse name Ragnar. The date falls within the period when Ragnar is supposed to have been active. The target Paris matches one of Ragnar's most famous exploits in the later saga tradition. But the annals of Saint-Bertin tell us nothing else about this man. No parentage, no kingdom, no serpent pit, no remarkable trousers, no shield maiden wives. Just a name, a raid, a ransom, and a death by bowel disease. The gap between this brief entry and the magnificent figure of later legend is vast enough to swallow entire libraries of speculation. The next layer of evidence comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled during the reign of Alfred the Great in the late 9th century, roughly 2 to 3 decades after the great heathen army's invasion. The Chronicle records the invasion in considerable detail, the army's movements, its battles, its leaders. It names Ivar and Halfdan explicitly as commanders. It records the capture of York in 866 and the killing of kings, but it never mentions Ragnar Lothbrok by name, not once. The father whose death supposedly motivated the entire invasion is a ghost in the very source that documents the invasion most thoroughly. The Chronicle's silence on this point is one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire debate. If the sons publicly claimed vengeance for their father, as later sources insist, why did the most detailed contemporary English record fail to name the man they were avenging? A possible answer comes from a later source. Asser, the Welsh monk who served as Alfred the Great's biographer, wrote his life of King Alfred around 893. Asser mentions the Viking leaders by name and describes their campaigns, but like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he does not mention Ragnar. Asser was writing within living memory of the invasion. He had access to eyewitnesses, to court records, to the oral testimony of men who had fought against the sons. His silence, like the Chronicles, is deafening. The Ragnar we know, the Ragnar of serpent pits and shield maidens and dragon slaying and magnificent death speeches, emerges from an entirely different world. He emerges from the Saga tradition, from texts written in Iceland between the 12th and 14th centuries, 200 to 500 years after the events they describe. And it is here that we must pause and understand what the Icelandic sagas actually were, because misunderstanding their nature is the single greatest source of confusion in the entire Ragnar debate. The saga tradition is one of the most remarkable literary achievements of the medieval world. Between approximately 1150 and 1400, Icelandic writers produced a body of prose narrative that has no parallel in European literature of the same period. These texts are vivid, psychologically complex, structurally sophisticated, and written in a deceptively plain style that gives them an air of historical reportage. Many modern readers, encountering the sagas for the first time, mistake them for history. They are not history. They're not fiction either. They occupy a category that the modern mind struggles to accommodate, a space between memory and mythology where real people and real events are reshaped by generations of oral retelling into something that serves the needs of story rather than the demands of evidence. The two primary saga sources for Ragnar's life are the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, known in Old Norse as Ragnar's Saga Lodbrokr, and the tale of Ragnar's sons, Ragnar's Sona Thatr. Both were composed in Iceland, almost certainly in the 13th century. and both draw on older oral traditions and now lost written sources that we can only partially reconstruct. A third major source is the Gesta Danorum, a sprawling Latin history of Denmark written by the Danish scholar Saxo Grammaticus around the year 1200. Saxo's work is not technically a saga, but it shares many of the saga tradition's characteristics, as Spralver, including its willingness to treat legendary material as historical fact. These three sources tell us almost everything we know about Ragnar Lothbrok's life, and they also contradict each other on virtually every major point. In the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar is the son of the Danish king Sigurd Ring, who won his throne by defeating his uncle Harald Wartooth at the legendary Battle of Bravelir. Ragnar inherits the kingdom of Denmark as a young man and proceeds to build a career of conquest, raiding, and romantic entanglement that spans decades and multiple marriages. His first wife, in this version, is Thora Townheart, a noble woman whose father gave her a tiny serpent that grew into a monstrous dragon coiled around her bower. Ragnar slays the dragon while wearing specially treated leather trousers coated in tar and sand to protect against the beast's venom. And it is from these remarkable garments that he earns his famous byname, Lothbrok, which translates to hairy breeches or shaggy trousers. After Thora's death, Ragnar encounters his most famous wife, Aslaug, also called Kreka, and Aslaug is presented as the secret daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, the Siegfried of Germanic tradition, and the Valkyrie Brynhild. She was raised in obscurity by foster parents after her true parents' deaths, her royal blood hidden beneath a peasant exterior. When Ragnar finds her, she is living in a farmhouse, but her wisdom and beauty mark her as something extraordinary. She proves her worth through a famous riddle. Ragnar sends for her and demands she arrive neither dressed nor undressed, neither hungry nor full, neither alone nor accompanied. Aslaug solves the riddle by arriving draped in a fishing net, biting an onion, and accompanied only by a dog. Ragnar, suitably impressed, marries her. Through Aslaug, Ragnar becomes the father of his most famous sons, Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Rognvald. Saxo Grammaticus tells a substantially different story. In the Gesta Danorum, Ragnar's parentage is different, his wives are different, his campaigns occur in a different order, and the entire chronological framework shifts by decades. Saxo's Ragnar is a more explicitly political figure, less the mythological dragon slayer and more the ambitious king navigating the complex power dynamics of Scandinavian royalty. The two accounts share certain landmarks: the raid on Paris, the famous sons, the death in the serpent pit, but they reach these landmarks by entirely different roads, and the roads themselves pass through landscapes that cannot be reconciled. The tale of Ragnar's sons offers yet a third perspective, focusing less on Ragnar himself and more on the careers of his descendants. This text provides the most detailed account of the great heathen army's invasion of England and the vengeance taken on King Ælla, including the notorious claim that Ivar and his brothers performed the blood eagle on Ælla, a ritualistic execution in which the victim's ribs were severed from the spine and pulled outward to form wings while the lungs were drawn through the opening. Whether the blood eagle was a real practice, a literary invention, or a misinterpretation of Norse poetry is itself one of the most debated questions in Viking studies. But the tale presents it as historical fact, as the culmination of the vengeance cycle begun by Ragnar's death. These three sources taken together give us a Ragnar who is simultaneously too much and too little. Too much because his exploits span too many decades. His genealogy connects to too many legendary figures. His enemies are too numerous and too geographically dispersed for any single human lifetime. The saga Ragnar fights battles in Scandinavia, raids across the Baltic, sacks Paris, invades England, and conducts campaigns from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The chronological span of his attributed deeds stretches from the early 9th century to the 860s, a period during which a real Ragnar would have progressed from vigorous youth to improbable old age. Too little, because for all this abundance of story, there is no single detail in any saga account that can be independently verified by a contemporary source. No Frankish chronicle says the man who attacked Paris was the father of Ivar. No English record says the Vikings claimed to be avenging a man named Ragnar who died in a snake pit. The connections that make the Ragnar legend cohere are all imposed by later writers working from oral tradition, not documented by witnesses. This is the heart of the problem, and it is the question we will try to answer. Was there a real man named Ragnar Lothbrok who lived these adventures and fathered these sons? Or did the storytelling traditions of the Norse world create him, stitching together the exploits of several historical figures into one legendary composite, a single magnificent life woven from the threads of many? To approach this question honestly, we need to do something that modern adaptations rarely bother with. We need to leave the saga world for a moment and enter the world of primary evidence, the Frankish chronicles, the Anglo-Saxon records, the Irish annals, the runic inscriptions, the archaeological evidence. We need to see what the 9th century actually looked like through the eyes of the people who lived in it, and then measure the Ragnar of legend against the reality they documented. The Europe that Ragnar supposedly terrorized was a continent in transformation. The year 800 had seen Charlemagne crowned as Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in Rome, an event that reconstituted the idea of unified Western European authority for the first time since the fall of Rome 4 centuries earlier. But Charlemagne's empire was already fracturing by the time of his death in 814. And under his successors, Louis the Pious, and then Louis's quarreling sons, it would splinter into the kingdoms that would eventually become France, Germany, and the patchwork of territories between them. This fragmentation mattered enormously for the Viking story, because a united Frankish empire could concentrate its military resources against seaborne raiders, while a divided one could not. The timing of the great Viking raids on Francia maps almost precisely onto the periods of Frankish civil war and political weakness. Across the English Channel, the British Isles presented a similarly fractured political landscape. In England, 4 major kingdoms competed for dominance: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the south and west. The smaller kingdoms and sub-kingdoms complicated the picture further. There was no King of England in the 9th century. The concept did not yet exist. Each kingdom maintained its own royal dynasty, its own military forces, its own diplomatic relationships. They fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. When the great heathen army arrived in 865, it exploited these divisions with surgical precision, playing kingdoms against each other, allying with one to destroy another, then turning on its former ally. The political genius of this strategy, attributed in the sagas primarily to Ivar, suggests a sophistication that goes far beyond the popular image of Vikings as mere barbarian raiders. Ireland, Scotland, and the wider Atlantic world presented their own complexities. Irish annals, written by monks in monasteries that were frequently targeted by Viking raiders, provide some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of Norse activity in the 9th century. These annals mention numerous Viking leaders by name, track their movements with considerable precision, and occasionally provide genealogical information that supplements or contradicts the saga tradition. For the Ragnar question, the Irish sources are particularly valuable because they mention several figures who may connect to the saga narrative, though the connections are, as always, tantalizingly uncertain. In Scandinavia itself, the 9th century was a period of profound social and political change. The traditional image of the Viking Age, independent chieftains leading bands of warriors on freelance raids, was giving way to something more organized. In Denmark, a process of political centralization was underway that would eventually produce a unified kingdom under the Jelling dynasty in the 10th century. In Norway, regional strongmen were competing for supremacy in conflicts that would culminate in Harald Fairhair's unification of the country around 870. In Sweden, the power dynamics were even more complex, with the Svea and Gotar peoples maintaining distinct identities even as they were gradually drawn into a single political entity. The Viking raids that struck Western Europe were not random acts of piracy. They were the external expression of these internal dynamics, the overflow of a society producing more ambitious, capable warriors and navigators than its domestic political structure could accommodate. A younger son who could not inherit land at home could acquire wealth and reputation abroad. A chieftain who lost a power struggle in Denmark could rebuild his fortunes raiding Francia. The line between political exile and pirate fleet commander was thin to the point of invisibility. It is into this context that we must place the historical Ragnar, if he existed. And the most concrete historical anchor we have is that raid on Paris in 845. The Frankish sources describe the attack in vivid terms. In March of that year, a Viking fleet entered the Seine estuary and began working its way upstream toward Paris. The Frankish king Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, gathered an army and divided it to defend both banks of the river. This division proved catastrophic. And the Viking leader, Ragnar, in the annals of Saint-Bertin, attacked one division of the Frankish army, routed it completely, and then hanged 111 prisoners on an island in the Seine in full view of the other Frankish division on the opposite bank. The psychological effect was devastating. The surviving Frankish forces refused to engage, and Charles the Bald was forced to negotiate. The ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver, was the first of what would become known as Danegeld, tribute paid to Viking armies to persuade them to leave. It set a precedent that would prove ruinous for both Francia and England over the following century, teaching successive generations of Viking leaders that Western European kingdoms would pay extraordinary sums rather than fight. The political and economic consequences of this single transaction rippled through European history for 200 years. Was Ragnar the man the sagas would later call Ragnar Lothbrok? The question seems simple, but it opens onto a labyrinth. The name is linguistically plausible as a Latinized form of Ragnar. The date and target match the saga tradition. But the annals of Saint-Bertin tell us that Ragnar died of disease shortly after the raid, apparently before returning to Scandinavia. If this is Ragnar, then Ragnar died around 845, which creates an immediate problem. The sagas place Ragnar's death in the snake pit of King Ælla of Northumbria sometime in the early 860s, roughly 2 decades later. If the same man died of dysentery on the Seine in 845, he could not have died in a Northumbrian dungeon in 865. One possible resolution is that the Frankish chroniclers were wrong about Ragnar's death, that he fell ill but recovered, that the report was wishful thinking by monks who interpreted any Viking misfortune as divine justice. Another is that Ragnar and Ragnar were different men, that a Viking leader named Ragnar did exist but was not the same person who raided Paris. A third possibility, and the one that many modern historians find most compelling, is that the saga tradition assigned the Paris raid to Ragnar because it was the most spectacular Viking exploit of the mid-9th century, and the legend naturally absorbed the greatest deeds of the era into a single heroic biography, regardless of who actually performed them. In this last interpretation, Ragnar as legendary composite is the thread we will follow most carefully as our story unfolds. But to follow it properly, we must first understand the world that created him. Not just the political world of kingdoms and armies, but the cultural world of the world of the scalds and the saga tellers, the men and women who shaped raw experience into the stories that would carry Ragnar's name across 1,000 years. The Norse relationship with storytelling was unlike anything in contemporary Christian Europe. In a society where literacy was limited to runic inscriptions, short formulaic texts carved on stone or wood useful for memorials and magical invocations, but not for extended narrative, the spoken word carried the full weight of cultural memory. The scalds, the court poets of Scandinavian kings, occupied a social position roughly comparable to that of a modern combination of journalist, propagandist, historian, and entertainer. They composed elaborate verse in complex meters that served as mnemonic structures, ensuring that important events, genealogies, and deeds would survive in memory across generations. Skaldic poetry was not free verse or improvisation. It followed rigid metrical rules, particularly the form called drotkvet, or court meter, that required specific patterns of alliteration, internal rhyme, syllable count, and a Baroque system of metaphorical circumlocution called kennings. A ship was not called a ship, but the horse of the waves. A warrior was the tree of battle. Gold was the fire of the sea. Blood was the sweat of swords. This system served a dual purpose. It created poetry of extraordinary density and beauty, and it made the poems extremely difficult to alter in transmission. You could not easily change a word in a drotkvet stanza without destroying the meter, which meant that skaldic verse, once composed, tended to be preserved with remarkable fidelity across generations of oral transmission. When scholars find a skaldic stanza attributed to a 9th century poet preserved in a 13th century saga, they can have reasonable confidence that the words, if not the attribution, are genuinely old. But skaldic poetry was composed to serve the interests of patrons. A king who commissioned a praise poem expected to hear his victories celebrated and his genealogy glorified. A poet who pleased his patron received gold, land, and social standing. A poet who displeased him risked exile or worse. This system created powerful incentives for inflation, attribution of others' deeds to the patron, and the gradual fusion of a patron's biography with legendary or mythological material that enhanced his prestige. A king who claimed descent from Odin, as many Norse kings did, was also implicitly claiming a lineage that connected him to the entire mythological framework of the Norse cosmos. His personal history and the cosmic history of the gods were not separate categories but nested narratives, each reinforcing the other. This is the crucible in which the Ragnar legend was forged. Not in a single moment of invention, but across generations of oral composition and recomposition, as poets attach great deeds to a great name, and the great name attracted ever more deeds, until the historical kernel, whatever it was, being Rebure, became invisible beneath the accumulated layers of legend. The process would have worked something like this. A real chieftain named Ragnar, perhaps the man who raided Paris, perhaps another leader of comparable stature, performed certain notable deeds in the mid-9th century. After his death, poets composed verses celebrating those deeds, and these verses entered the repertoire of oral tradition. Over the following decades, as the deeds of other chieftains faded from memory or as their descendants fell from political prominence, in some of those orphaned exploits gravitated toward the most famous name available. A raid on the English coast that was historically led by an otherwise forgotten jarl became, in the retelling, another raid by Ragnar. A battle in the Baltic attributed to one king was reassigned to Ragnar because Ragnar made for a better story. The sons, Ivar, Halfdan, Björn, Sigurd, were historical figures in their own right, documented in contemporary sources. Their prominence reflected backward onto their supposed father, making him larger in retrospect than he may have been in life. The mythological connections, the dragon-slaying Aslog's descent from Sigurd and Brynhild, were added to anchor the legend in the deeper mythological past, connecting Ragnar's lineage to the Volsung cycle, the most prestigious heroic tradition in all of Norse literature. By the time the sagas were written down in 13th century Iceland, 2 to 4 centuries after the events they describe, the process of legendary accretion had produced a figure of impossible scope and grandeur. And the saga writers, working from oral sources they could not verify and genealogical traditions they had every reason to accept, wrote it all down as if it were biography. This is not to say the saga writers were naive or dishonest. They were working within a literary tradition that did not draw the sharp modern distinction between history and story. For a 13th century Icelander, a narrative could be simultaneously true in the sense that it preserved genuine memory of real events and shaped in the sense that the details had been arranged, enhanced, and connected for narrative and ideological purposes. The modern insistence that a story must be either factual or fictional with nothing in between would have struck them as bizarre. They lived in a world where the boundary between the two was a spectrum, not a wall. Understanding this is essential for everything that follows in our investigation. We are not trying to prove Ragnar real or declare him fake. We are trying to understand what kind of reality he occupied, a reality that was neither the solid ground of documented history nor the pure air of invention, but something more like the coastline between land and sea, a shifting, unstable, endlessly fascinating boundary where fact and legend merge and separate with the tides of time and telling. To walk that coastline, we will need to follow multiple paths simultaneously. We will trace the historical records of the 9th century and score the Frankish annals, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, the Irish sources, be looking for the real men and real events that the Ragnar legend may have absorbed. We will follow the Saga tradition from its oral roots to its written flowering, examining how legends grow and what they preserve even as they transform. We will meet the sons, those undeniably historical figures whose very existence is the strongest argument that something resembling Ragnar once lived. And we will confront the most uncomfortable possibility of all, that the truth about Ragnar Lothbrok may be not that he existed or that he didn't, but that the question itself misunderstands the nature of historical memory in an oral culture. But before we can do any of that, we must go back further than the raids, further than the sagas, further even than the Viking age itself. We must go back to the world that produced men like Ragnar, or men like the men who became Ragnar. We must go back to Scandinavia on the eve of the Viking explosion, to the longhouses and the fjords, the ship burials and the thing assemblies, the harsh and luminous landscape where a culture of breathtaking creativity and terrible violence was about to burst its geographic boundaries and remake the world. The roots of everything that follows lie in that landscape, in that culture, in the particular alchemy of geography, technology, belief, and ambition that transformed a collection of farming and fishing communities on the northern edge of Europe into the most feared and admired seafarers the world had ever known. To understand Ragnar, real or imagined, we must first understand the world that could have made him, and the world that certainly made his legend. That world begins with the sea. The Scandinavian peninsula and the Danish archipelago occupy a geographic position that is, in the context of the early medieval world, both a prison and a launching pad. To the north, the land dissolves into Arctic tundra, a vast luminous emptiness where the sun vanishes for months and the cold is a physical force that kills as surely as any blade. To the east, the Baltic Sea stretches toward the flat marshlands of what is now Poland and the Baltic states, and beyond them the river systems that reach deep into the Slavic interior toward Constantinople and Baghdad. To the west, the North Sea heaves against a coastline so fractured by fjords, islands, and skerries that the total length of Norway's coast, if every inlet were straightened, would stretch halfway around the world. And to the south, across the narrow bottleneck of the Jutland Peninsula, lies continental Europe, wealthy, Christian, literate, and in the 8th century almost entirely undefended from seaborne attack. This geography created a people for whom the sea was not a barrier but a highway. The Norse did not overcome the ocean, they inhabited it. From the earliest periods of Scandinavian settlement, communities clustered along coastlines and fjord systems, not in the interior. The interior was mountain and forest, beautiful and brutal, useful for summer grazing but hostile to permanent large-scale agriculture. The coast was where life happened. Fish provided protein, seals and whales provided oil and bone. The sheltered waters of the fjords provided calm anchorages, and the tidal patterns of the North Atlantic provided, for those who understood them, a rhythm as reliable as any road. A child born into this world learned the sea the way a child of the steppe learned horses, not as a skill acquired through formal instruction, but as an environment absorbed through every pore from the moment of birth, the sound of water against a hull, the behavior of wind in a sail. the particular shade of green that ocean water takes on when shallow rocks lie beneath the surface, the way seabirds congregate over feeding fish, marking the underwater geography as clearly as any map. These were not specialized pieces of knowledge held by a navigator class. They were the common inheritance of every coastal Scandinavian, as natural as breathing and as essential as food. But what transformed this maritime culture from a regional phenomenon into a global force was a single technological achievement, one that was centuries in the making, and that reached its mature form in the decades immediately preceding the Viking Age: the longship. The Norse longship is one of those rare human inventions that achieves something close to perfection within its design parameters. It is not merely a good boat. It is a solution so elegant, so precisely matched to its environment and purpose, that it seems less designed than evolved, as if the sea itself had shaped the hull over millennia of trial and error. And in a sense, that is exactly what happened. The archaeological record shows a clear progression of Scandinavian shipbuilding from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age, each generation refining the techniques of the last. The fundamental innovation was clinker construction, overlapping planks, riveted together, and then attached to an internal frame, rather than the Mediterranean method of building a frame first and then attaching planks to it. Clinker construction produced hulls that were simultaneously strong and flexible, capable of absorbing the punishment of North Atlantic waves rather than resisting them rigidly. A clinker-built hull moves with the sea. It bends and twists along its length as waves pass beneath it, distributing stress across the entire structure rather than concentrating it at weak points. A Mediterranean vessel in a North Sea storm fights the water. A Norse vessel dances with it. The other crucial innovations were the shallow draft and the dual propulsion system. A fully loaded Viking longship might draw as little as half a meter of water, shallow enough to sail up rivers that no other seagoing vessel of the period could penetrate, shallow enough to beach on any sand or gravel shore without the need for a harbor or a dock. This transformed every river mouth in Europe into a potential invasion route, and every beach into a potential landing zone. The defensive calculations that had protected European coastlines for centuries, calculations based on the assumption that seaborne attackers needed deep harbors and calm anchorages, became overnight as useless as a wall with no foundation. Dual propulsion meant that the longship carried both a square sail for open water passages and oars for maneuvering in rivers, along coastlines, and during the final approach to a target. Under sail, a longship could make 8 to 10 knots in favorable conditions, crossing the North Sea from Norway to England in as little as 2 days. Under oars, it could maintain 5 to 6 knots for short bursts, giving it the ability to outrun pursuit, navigate narrow channels, and arrive at a target with a speed that defenders found almost supernatural. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle repeatedly records the shock of Viking attacks that seemed to come from nowhere. A fleet appearing off a coast with no advance warning, warriors ashore before any alarm could be raised, the attack over, and the ships gone before a defensive force could be mustered. This was not magic. It was engineering. The ships that carried the great heathen army to England in 865, the ships that carried whatever man or men the Saga tradition would later call Ragnar, were the product of this centuries-long refinement. They were not crude vessels. They were masterworks. The Gokstad ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1880 and dating to approximately 890, provides our best physical evidence of what a high-status longship of the late 9th century looked like. 23 meters long, 5 meters wide, built of oak with 16 strakes per side, capable of carrying a crew of 34 oarsmen plus additional warriors, stores, and equipment. The hull planks are only 2.5 centimeters thick in places, shaved down to reduce weight without sacrificing strength. Every timber is selected for its natural grain, curved pieces chosen from naturally curved trees so that the wood's strength follows the line of the hull rather than fighting it. The workmanship is not merely functional, it is beautiful. The Norse built ships the way other cultures built cathedrals, as expressions of the highest values of their civilization, and it was through these ships that the Viking Age began. The traditional date for the start of the Viking Age is 793, the year a Norwegian raiding party attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the Frankish court where he served as an advisor to Charlemagne, captured the shock of the event in a letter that still resonates across 12 centuries. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, he wrote. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. Alcuin's horror was genuine, and it reflected something that modern audiences accustomed to thinking of Vikings as fascinating cultural figures sometimes forget. To the people who experienced them, Viking raids were not adventures. They were atrocities. Monasteries were targeted not because the Norse had any particular animosity toward Christianity, though they certainly did not share its values, but because monasteries were where the wealth was, in an era when the church was the single largest landowner and the single most important repository of precious metals in Western Europe. A monastery represented a concentration of portable wealth defended by men who had taken vows of nonviolence. From a purely strategic perspective, it was an almost irresistible target. The decade following Lindisfarne saw raids on other island monasteries, Iona in 795, Rathlin Island off the Irish coast in the same year, Inishmurray in 807. These early attacks followed a pattern: swift, opportunistic strikes on exposed coastal targets, rapid extraction of plunder, immediate withdrawal before local forces could respond. The raiders came in small groups, a few ships, perhaps 100 men at most, and they did not attempt to hold territory. They came, they took, they left. But by the 830s and 840s, the pattern was changing. The raids grew larger, more organized, and more ambitious. Viking fleets began overwintering in the territories they attacked, establishing permanent or semi-permanent bases from which they could launch sustained campaigns. In Ireland, the Norse founded the trading settlement of Dublin around 841, creating a foothold that would persist for 3 centuries. In Francia, Viking armies began penetrating deep into the interior, sailing up the Loire, the Seine, and the Garonne to strike at targets hundreds of miles from the coast. The shift from raiding to invasion, from piracy to conquest was underway. It is in this context, the escalation of Viking activity from opportunistic raids to strategic campaigns in the 840s, that the historical Ragnar, if he existed, would have operated. And the Paris raid of 845 sits precisely at the inflection point, in the moment when the Viking threat transformed from a serious nuisance into an existential danger to the established powers of Western Europe. But to understand why a man like Ragnar, or rather the type of man that Ragnar represents, could emerge from Norse society, we need to look beyond the ships and the raids and into the social structures that produced the warriors who crewed them. Norse society in the 9th century was stratified but not rigid. At its summit sat the konungur, the king, though this title carried a meaning considerably different from what later medieval monarchy would imply. A Norse king was not an absolute ruler governing through institutional authority. He was, fundamentally, a war leader whose power depended on his ability to attract and retain the loyalty of free warriors through the distribution of wealth and the demonstration of martial prowess. The bond between a king and his retainers was personal, not institutional. A king who lost battles, who failed to distribute plunder generously, who showed cowardice or poor judgment, could find his followers melting away to serve a more successful rival. Kingship in this world was less a position than a performance, constantly renewed through action and constantly threatened by failure. Below the king came the jarls, the aristocratic class, great landowners and regional leaders who commanded their own retinues and who owed allegiance to the king that was real but conditional. A jarl who felt his king was weak or unjust could withdraw his support, taking his warriors with him. Below the jarls were the carls, the free farmers who formed the backbone of Norse society. These were not peasants in the later European sense, landless laborers tied to a lord's estate. They were independent property owners with legal rights, political voices exercised through the Thing assemblies, and the obligation and privilege of bearing arms. At the base of the hierarchy were the thralls, enslaved persons who had been captured in raids, purchased in markets, or born into servitude. Thralls had no legal standing and could be bought, sold, or killed at their owner's discretion. The Viking economy was, among other things, a slave economy, and the capture and trade of human beings was one of the primary drivers of Norse expansion. The Thing assembly, the governing institution from which the modern English word derives, was where free men gathered to resolve disputes, make laws, and conduct the collective business of the community. The Thing was not a democracy in any modern sense, but it did impose real constraints on royal and aristocratic power. A king who violated customary law could be challenged at the Thing. Blood feuds that threatened to destabilize the community could be mediated through legal arbitration. Outlawry, the declaration that a man stood outside the protection of law, the rearer, was the Thing's most fearsome sanction, stripping the outlaw of every social protection and making it legal for anyone to kill him without consequence. It was within this social framework that the warrior ethos operated. A man's reputation, his honor, his fame, his legacy was the currency that mattered most. In a world without writing, without enduring institutions, without any mechanism for preserving a person's memory beyond the spoken word, the only immortality available was the immortality of story. A man who performed great deeds and had those deeds remembered by poets would live forever in the recitation of his exploits. A man who lived and died unremarkably would vanish as completely as if he had never existed. This was not metaphor to the Norse. It was theology. The Havamal, a collection of wisdom verses attributed to Odin himself and preserved in the poetic Edda, states the principle with stark clarity. Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will also die, but the word about you will never die, if you win a good reputation. This cult of reputation created powerful incentives for exactly the kind of behavior that would later be attributed to Ragnar Lothbrok. The dragon slaying, the impossible voyages, the defiant death, the famous last words. These were not merely entertaining story elements. They were the building blocks of the only form of immortality the Norse believed in. A man who wanted to be remembered needed to perform deeds worthy of remembering, and the greater the deed, the more secure the memory. Killing an ordinary warrior earned a line in a poem. Killing a king earned a stanza. Slaying a dragon earned a saga. And here we encounter a circularity that lies at the very heart of the Ragnar problem. Nay, the social system that produced Viking leaders also produced the storytelling tradition that preserved its surmorf and distorted their memory. The same culture that rewarded extraordinary deeds with poetic immortality also provided the mechanism by which ordinary deeds could be inflated into extraordinary ones across generations of retelling. A chieftain who raided a wealthy monastery became, in the telling, a chieftain who sacked a city. A man who killed a rival in single combat became a man who slew a dragon. A leader who died in battle became a leader who died in a snake pit, defiant to the last breath, composing his own death poem as the venom consumed him. The Norse did not lie about their heroes. They did something more subtle and more powerful. They remembered them in the way that best served the culture's need for exemplary figures, figures who embodied the virtues the society valued, who demonstrated the rewards of courage and the price of cowardice, who showed future generations what a life fully lived looked like. The historical Ragnar, whatever his actual deeds, was raw material. The legendary Ragnar was the finished product, crafted by generations of poets and storytellers into a figure so compelling that the original materials became invisible beneath the artistry. This brings us to religion, because the Norse understanding of fate, death, and the afterlife shaped everything about how they told stories and why. The The cosmology of the pre-Christian Norse was not a system of belief in the way that Christianity was a system of belief. It was less dogma than worldview, less theology than attitude. At its center was the conviction that the universe was temporary, that the gods themselves were mortal, and that the end of all things, Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, was not a possibility but a certainty. Odin, the Allfather, chief of the Aesir, had traded his eye for wisdom and hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain knowledge of the runes. And what he learned through these sacrifices was that even he could not prevent the final destruction. The wolf Fenrir would swallow the sun. The world serpent Jörmungandr would rise from the ocean. The dead would sail from the realm of hell on a ship made of fingernails, and the gods would ride out to meet their enemies, knowing they would die. This fatalism had profound consequences for how the Norse understood human life. If even the gods could not escape their fate, then mortals certainly could not. But this did not produce passivity or despair, quite the opposite. If death was inevitable, then the manner of death became the only thing a person could control. And if the manner of death determined how you were remembered, then a good death, a brave death, a defiant death, a death that demonstrated everything you had lived for, was the ultimate achievement of a human life. The warrior who fell in battle with his weapon in his hand would be chosen by Odin's Valkyries to join the Einherjar in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where he would feast and fight until Ragnarök came and he marched out beside the gods for the final battle. The man who died of old age or illness, the straw death, as the Norse contemptuously called it, dying on a bed of straw, earned no such glory. This theological framework makes Ragnar's death scene in the saga tradition not merely dramatic, but spiritually essential. The snake pit is not just a method of execution. It is a test, the ultimate test of the values the entire culture holds sacred. Ragnar thrown into a pit of venomous serpents by a Christian king who thinks he is destroying his enemy transforms the moment of his death into the moment of his greatest triumph. He does not beg. He does not weep. He composes a poem, the Krakumal, the Song of the Crow, a death poem of stunning defiance and dark beauty in which he recounts the battles of his life, celebrates the comrades who fell beside him, and faces his end with something that transcends courage. It gladdens me to know that Baldur's father makes ready the benches for a banquet, the poem declares. Soon we shall be drinking ale from the curved horns. The champion who comes into Odin's dwelling does not lament his death. I shall not enter his hall with words of fear upon my lips. The Krakumal is almost certainly not by Ragnar. Linguistic analysis places its composition in the 12th century, 300 years after the events it describes. It is a literary creation, a retrospective imagining of what a perfect Viking death would sound like. But its cultural function is more important than its authorship. It crystallizes the Norse death ideal into a single unforgettable scene, and it attaches that ideal to the name of Ragnar Lothbrok, making Ragnar not just a legendary king, but the very archetype of how a Norse hero should face the end. This is what the Sagas were doing when they told Ragnar's story. They were not writing biography, they were writing scripture, the sacred narrative of a warrior culture embodied in a single exemplary life. And the power of that narrative was so great that it reached across centuries, survived the conversion to Christianity, survived the end of the Viking Age, survived the transformation of Scandinavian society from pagan warrior culture to Christian feudal monarchy, and emerged in the 13th century in written sagas that are still being read at Moss and adapted for television 800 years later. But we have lingered long enough in the world of myth and cultural context. The question remains, beneath all the layers of legend, was there a real man? To answer this, we must turn to the most concrete evidence available, the historical sons, because while Ragnar himself is a phantom in contemporary sources, his supposed children are not. They stride through the 9th century in record after record, documented by monks, chroniclers, and annalists who had every reason to record their deeds accurately because those deeds were destroying the world those writers inhabited. Ivar the Boneless is the most prominent and the most enigmatic. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 is consistently attributed to his leadership in both English and Irish sources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle names him as a commander. Irish annals refer to a figure called Imhar, who is almost universally identified by scholars as the same man. This Imhar appears in the Irish records as a major Viking leader active in both Ireland and Britain during the 860s and 870s, suggesting a figure of extraordinary range and ambition who operated across multiple theaters simultaneously. The Irish annals describe Imhar as the king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, a title of remarkable scope that suggests he commanded authority far beyond a single warband or a single campaign. His activities in Ireland included the establishment of Viking power in Dublin and involvement in complex political maneuvering among rival Norse factions. His death is recorded in the Annals of Ulster under the year 873. Imhar, king of the Norsemen of the whole of Ireland and Britain, ended his life. The entry offers no cause of death, no dramatic scene, no final words. Just a bald statement of fact that a powerful man had died. Halfdan, another of Ragnar's supposed sons, appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a leader of the great heathen army who, after the initial campaigns in Northumbria and East Anglia, turned his attention to conquering territory for permanent settlement. In 876, the Chronicle records that Halfdan divided up the land of Northumbria among his followers, who were plowing and providing for themselves. This single sentence marks one of the most consequential moments in English history. The transformation of Viking warriors from raiders into settlers, from destroyers of kingdoms into builders of a new society. The Danelaw, that vast region of eastern and northern England governed by Scandinavian custom, has its origins in this distribution of land by Halfdan among his warriors. Halfdan's ultimate fate is recorded in the Irish annals, which describe him dying in a battle at Strangford Lough in 877, fighting against other Norse factions. The same man who had conquered a kingdom in England died fighting fellow Vikings in Ireland. A reminder that the neat narrative lines of the sagas bear little resemblance to the chaotic, multi-directional reality of 9th century Norse political life. Björn Ironside, if the saga identification is correct, may be connected to a figure who appears in Frankish sources as a leader of Viking raids in the Mediterranean during the 850s and 860s. A Norse fleet penetrated the Strait of Gibraltar, raided along the coasts of Spain and North Africa, entered the Mediterranean, and attacked targets in southern France and Italy. The Frankish sources name the leaders of this expedition as Björn and Hastein, and the saga tradition identifies this Björn as one of Ragnar's sons. The Mediterranean expedition is one of the most remarkable episodes in the entire Viking Age. Norse longships operating thousands of miles from Scandinavia, in waters that had been a Roman lake for centuries, attacking cities that had not seen northern raiders since the Vandals crossed in the 5th century. Sigurd's snake in the eye is the most poorly documented of the major sons in contemporary sources, but later, Scandinavian genealogical traditions make him an ancestor of the Danish royal house, connecting the Ragnar legend directly to the political legitimacy of the medieval Danish kingdom. This genealogical function may be one of the most important keys to understanding why the Ragnar legend took the form it did. If the kings of Denmark claimed descent from Ragnar through Sigurd, then the entire saga tradition about Ragnar served a dynastic purpose, legitimizing the ruling house by connecting it to the most prestigious, heroic lineage available. The pattern that emerges from this survey of the sons is striking. The sons are real. Their deeds are documented. Their impact on history is undeniable. They operated across a geographic range that stretches from Dublin to York to the Mediterranean, commanding armies, founding settlements, reshaping the political map of Europe. And multiple independent sources, English, Irish, Frankish, record their activities without apparent coordination or mutual influence. But the sources disagree on whether these men were actually brothers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does not describe them as such. The Irish annals treat Imhar as a figure in his own right without reference to a famous father. The Frankish sources mention Björn without connecting him to Ivar or Halfdan. It is only the later Saga tradition, writing centuries after the fact, that gathers these various historical figures under a single paternal umbrella and declares them all sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. This is the crux of the argument for Ragnar as composite legend. The sons existed independently. Each had his own career, his own sphere of operation, his own place in the historical record. The saga tradition's genius was to connect them, to take several prominent Viking leaders of the mid to late 9th century and retroactively declare them brothers, sons of a single extraordinary father whose biography could then absorb the greatest exploits of an entire generation. Ragnar became the node in a network, the point where separate historical threads were tied together into a single narrative knot. If this interpretation is correct, then Ragnar Lothbrok is not a fiction. He is something more interesting than a fiction. He is a legend, a figure constructed from real historical materials by a culture that valued story above documentation, memory above record, and meaning above fact. He is the answer to a question that the Norse storytelling tradition was always asking. What would the perfect Viking life look like? And the answer, refined across 3 centuries of oral tradition, was Ragnar. A man born to royalty but forced to earn his kingdom through deeds, a slayer of monsters, a lover of extraordinary women, a father of sons who would shake the world, a man who faced his death not with fear but with a smile and a prophecy, secure in the knowledge that his name would outlive his flesh. The problem, of course, is that legends have consequences. The great heathen army was real. The invasion of England was real. The destruction of kingdoms, the death of kings, the reshaping of an entire civilization, all of this happened. And every source that attempts to explain why it happened points back, eventually, to the same story. A father died. His sons came for revenge. The old boar suffered, and the little piglets grunted. On whether the father was one man or many, whether the snake pit was a dungeon in Northumbria or a metaphor woven from poetry and wishful memory, the vengeance was real. And to understand what that vengeance looked like, what it cost the people of England, and what it built in the ruins of their world, we must leave the question of Ragnar's existence suspended for a moment, like a sword hanging by a thread, and turn our attention to the land where his sons came to collect their debt. England in the year 865 was not prepared for what was coming. No one could have been. The 4 kingdoms that divided the island among themselves had spent the better part of 3 centuries fighting each other with a regularity that bordered on ritual. Northumbria, the great northern realm stretching from the Humber to the Firth of Forth, had been the dominant power in the 7th century. The age of Bede, of Lindisfarne's golden manuscripts, of a Christian intellectual culture that rivaled anything on the continent. But by the 9th century, Northumbria was tearing itself apart from within. Civil war had become endemic. Kings were deposed, murdered, and replaced with a frequency that made stable governance impossible. In the decade before the great heathen army's arrival, Northumbria had seen 2 rival kings, Osbert and Ælla, fighting for control of a kingdom that neither could hold securely. The very man whom the sagas identify as Ragnar's killer, Ælla, was himself a usurper who had seized the throne through violence and who faced constant challenges to his legitimacy. Mercia, the Midland Kingdom, was the strongest military power in England during the 8th century under kings like Offa, who built the Great Dyke along the Welsh border and corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal. But Mercia too had declined, its energies consumed by internal succession disputes and border conflicts with its neighbors. East Anglia, the flat, fertile kingdom of the eastern coast, was wealthy but militarily weak, a prosperous target with inadequate defenses. And Wessex, the southern kingdom that would ultimately prove the sole survivor of the Viking onslaught, was in 865 still finding its footing under a royal house that had produced competent but not yet extraordinary leaders. The critical weakness was not military but structural. These kingdoms had no mechanism for coordinated defense. There was no alliance system, no mutual aid treaty, no unified command that could pool the military resources of all four kingdoms against a common threat. Each kingdom defended its own borders with its own forces, and when one kingdom fell, the others were as likely to see opportunity as danger. The Vikings understood this with devastating clarity. The strategy of the great heathen army. Land in one kingdom, use it as a base to attack another, play local political factions against each other, and destroy each kingdom in sequence rather than confronting all of them simultaneously, was not the strategy of barbarian raiders. It was the strategy of men who understood power, who studied their enemies, and who exploited structural weakness with the precision of surgeons. The army that arrived in East Anglia in the autumn of 865 was something England had never seen before. Previous Viking raids on England had followed the established pattern: swift coastal strikes, rapid withdrawal, no attempt at permanent occupation. The great heathen army was different in kind. This was not a raiding party. It was an invasion force, equipped and provisioned for sustained campaigning, led by commanders who intended to stay until their objectives were achieved. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's description of its arrival in East Anglia is terse but telling. The army landed, made peace with the East Anglians, who provided them with horses in exchange for being left unmolested, and then, thus mounted, rode north. The provision of horses is a detail that deserves pause. Vikings did not typically fight on horseback. Their tactical tradition was infantry-based, centered on the shield wall. But they understood the strategic value of mounted mobility, the ability to move faster than news of their approach could travel, to appear at the gates of a city before its defenders knew they had left their previous position. The East Anglians, by giving the army horses, had unwittingly provided the invaders with the one resource they lacked: the ability to project power across the English interior at cavalry speed while fighting on foot when battle was joined. It was a transaction that East Anglia would pay for dearly in the years to come. The army's first target was York. York, Eoforwic in Old English, Jorvik in the Norse tongue it would soon acquire, was the most important city in northern England. It was a Roman foundation, built where the river Ouse met the river Foss, and its Roman walls still stood, in providing a defensive perimeter that had sheltered the city for 8 centuries. It was an ecclesiastical center, seat of an archbishop whose authority extended across the entire north. It was a commercial hub connected by river and road to the wider world. And it was the capital of a kingdom at war with itself. The timing of the attack was not coincidental. Ivar, if we accept the Saga tradition's identification of him as the army's strategic mind, chose to strike Northumbria precisely because it was divided. Osbert and Ælla, the rival kings, were so consumed by their conflict with each other that they failed to respond to the Viking advance until it was too late. On November 1st, 866, All Saints' Day, a date whose symbolic resonance would not have been lost on Christian chroniclers, the great heathen army seized York. The capture itself was apparently swift. The city may have been lightly defended, its garrison depleted by the Civil War. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event without describing a battle, suggesting that York fell with minimal resistance. It was only afterward, when the shock of the loss penetrated through the fog of civil war, that Osbert and Ælla managed what neither had been able to achieve in years of rivalry. They reconciled. They combined their forces, and on March 21st, 867, they led a joint assault on the Viking-held city, determined to retake it. The assault breached the walls. The fighting moved into the streets. And there, in the narrow spaces between Roman masonry and timber-framed houses, the Northumbrian army was destroyed. Both kings were killed. 8 Northumbrian ealdormen died beside them. The army that had been Northumbria's last military force was shattered so completely that the kingdom never recovered its independence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the aftermath with the flat finality of a death certificate. The Northumbrians made peace with the Vikings and accepted a puppet king who ruled at the invaders' pleasure. The Saga tradition claims that Ælla was subjected to the blood eagle after the battle, his ribs hacked from his spine, his lungs pulled through the opening and spread across his back like wings, a ritualistic execution presented as the ultimate expression of the sons' vengeance for their father's death in the snake pit. The historicity of this claim is one of the most contentious questions in Viking studies. The blood eagle appears in several saga texts, always described with the same basic elements, being always presented as a punishment reserved for enemies of extraordinary significance. Some scholars accept it as a genuine, if rare, Norse practice. Others argue that it is a literary invention, a misreading of skaldic poetry in which metaphorical descriptions of battle carnage were later interpreted as literal ritual. Still others suggest a middle ground, that exceptional battlefield mutilation occurred and was subsequently stylized by the saga tradition into a formalized ritual that may never have existed in the precise form the texts describe. What is beyond dispute is that Ælla died during or immediately after the battle for York, and that his death was celebrated by the invaders as the fulfillment of a blood debt. Whether that celebration involved ritual mutilation or simply the satisfaction of killing a king who had, in their tradition, killed their father, the symbolic weight was the same. The old boar had been avenged, the piglets had grunted, but vengeance, it turned out, was only the beginning. After the fall of Northumbria, the great heathen army did not disband and sail home. It turned south. Over the following years, it conducted a systematic campaign against the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that was less a war than a demolition project, dismantling the political structures of England one by one with methodical, almost administrative efficiency. In 869, the army moved against East Anglia, the same kingdom that had provided the horses 4 years earlier. King Edmund of East Anglia, a young man who would later be canonized as a saint and martyr, met the Viking force in battle and was defeated. The manner of Edmund's death became one of the most powerful narratives of the Anglo-Saxon Church. According to the later hagiographic tradition, he was captured, refused to renounce his Christian faith, and was tied to a tree, shot full of arrows until his body resembled a hedgehog, and then beheaded. Like the blood eagle, the precise details of Edmund's death are debated. What is certain is that he died, his kingdom fell, and East Anglia joined Northumbria under Viking control. Mercia came next. The great Midland Kingdom, which had been the dominant power in England a century earlier, proved unable to resist the Viking advance. In 870 and 871, the army established a base at Reading and launched a series of attacks into Wessex and Mercia simultaneously, stretching the defensive resources of both kingdoms beyond their capacity. Mercia's king, Burgred, fought on for several years with diminishing effectiveness before finally abandoning his kingdom altogether and fleeing to Rome in 874, where he died in exile. The Vikings installed another puppet ruler and proceeded to carve up Mercian territory. By 874, 3 of England's 4 kingdoms had fallen. Northumbria was a Viking client state. East Anglia was under direct Norse control. Mercia had been partitioned, its eastern half absorbed into what would become the Danelaw, its western rump surviving only at the invaders' sufferance. Only Wessex remained, and Wessex was on its knees. It is here that the Ragnar story intersects with perhaps the most consequential figure in English history, a young man who had never expected to be king, who was thrust onto the throne by the successive deaths of his elder brothers during the Viking Wars, and who inherited a kingdom that most observers would have considered already lost. Alfred, 4th son of King Æthelwulf, became king of Wessex in 871 at approximately 22 years of age. He stepped into a catastrophe. Alfred's early reign was a litany of desperate battles and negotiated truces, each bought at enormous cost, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records no fewer than 9 major engagements between Wessex and the Vikings in 871 alone, an intensity of warfare that would have exhausted far richer and more populous kingdoms. Alfred won some of these battles and lost others, but the overall trajectory was unmistakably downward. The Viking army was too large, too experienced, and too well led to be defeated by the resources of a single kingdom, however determined its leader. The crisis reached its nadir in January 878. A Viking force under a leader named Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack on the royal estate at Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating Twelfth Night. The attack was devastating. Alfred was caught almost completely off guard, a failure of intelligence that suggests either extraordinary Viking operational security or a betrayal within Alfred's own court. The king escaped with a small bodyguard and fled into the Somerset marshes, the trackless wetlands of the Somerset levels, where the waterlogged terrain provided natural concealment that no pursuer could easily penetrate. For several months in the winter and spring of 878, the King of Wessex lived as a fugitive in his own kingdom. This is the period that later legend would associate with the famous story of Alfred burning the cakes, a tale almost certainly apocryphal, but symbolically perfect. The image of a king reduced to such obscurity that a peasant woman could scold him for ruining her baking without knowing who he was. The deeper truth behind the legend is that Alfred's position was genuinely desperate. Wessex had effectively collapsed as an organized state. Much of the population had submitted to Guthrum or fled. The continuation of English independence hinged on the survival and recovery of a single man hiding in a swamp. What happened next is one of the most remarkable reversals in military history. From his refuge in the marshes, Alfred sent out messengers to the loyal remnants of the Wessex military class, the Thanes and Ealdormen who had not submitted to the Vikings, summoning them to a general muster. In May 878, they came. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that when Alfred rode to the assembly point at Egbert's Stone on the edge of Selwood Forest, the men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire were waiting for him, and they rejoiced to see him. Alfred led this reconstituted army to Edington, where Guthrum's Viking force was encamped. The battle that followed was the decisive engagement of the entire Viking invasion of England. Alfred's forces attacked in a single-massed shield wall and fought, according to the Chronicle, fiercely with a compact shield wall against the entire army. The Vikings broke. Guthrum and his surviving warriors retreated to their fortification and were besieged for 14 days before surrendering. The peace that followed, the Treaty of Wedmore and the subsequent Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum was not a return to the status quo. It was the foundation of a new political reality. Guthrum accepted baptism with Alfred standing as his godfather, a symbolic submission that was simultaneously religious conversion and political subordination. England was formally divided. Wessex and western Mercia remained under Alfred's authority, while eastern and northern England, the Danelaw, was recognized as territory under Scandinavian law and governance. The boundary line ran roughly along the old Roman road called Watling Street from London to Chester, creating a division that would shape English history for the next century. The Danelaw was not a single unified state, but a collection of territories governed by various Norse and Danish leaders operating under a shared legal framework derived from Scandinavian customary law. In Northumbria, the Viking kingdom of York became a major political entity in its own right, ruled by a succession of Norse kings whose interactions with the English, the Irish Norse, and the Norwegian kingdom created a web of political relationships of extraordinary complexity. In East Anglia and the East Midlands, the Scandinavian settlers established the 5 boroughs, Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, and Stamford, semi-autonomous urban centers that served as the political and military nuclei of the region. In East Anglia itself, a Scandinavian ruling class governed a predominantly English population, creating the kind of hybrid society that would leave its mark on English language, law, and culture for centuries. The linguistic evidence alone tells the story of how thoroughly the Scandinavian settlement transformed eastern England. Hundreds of place names across the Danelaw derive from Old Norse, any town ending in by meaning farmstead, Darby, Whitby, Grimsby, or Thorpe meaning village, Cleethorpes, Scunthorpe, or Thwaite meaning clearing, Braithwaite, Satterthwaite, marks a settlement founded or renamed by Scandinavian colonists. The density of these names in eastern England is such that in some counties, Norse-derived place names outnumber English ones, and the influence extends beyond geography into the very fabric of the English language. The words they, them, and their are Norse imports replacing the original Old English pronouns sky, egg, knife, husband, window, law, wrong, die, take, get, give, all derive from Old Norse. The language you are hearing right now carries the genetic imprint of the invasion that Ragnar's sons allegedly launched. This is the scale of the consequence. Whether or not a single man named Ragnar Lothbrok ever drew breath, the events attributed to his son's vengeance reshaped the English language, redrew the political map of Britain, and forced into existence the unified English kingdom that would eventually emerge from Alfred's desperate stand at Edington. Without the great heathen army, there is no Danelaw. Without the Danelaw, there is no Alfred the Great, because Alfred's greatness was forged in the crucible of near annihilation, and without the threat he would have been merely Alfred the Competent. Without Alfred, the gradual reconquest of the Danelaw by his children and grandchildren, a process that created the Kingdom of England as a unified political entity for the first time in history, might never have occurred. The sons of Ragnar, by destroying the old England of four competing kingdoms, inadvertently created the conditions for a new England to emerge. It is one of history's most savage ironies. But we must not lose the central question in the sweep of these consequences. The sons did what the sources say they did. This is established. The invasion happened. The kingdoms fell. The Danelaw was created. What remains unresolved is the connective tissue. The claim that these various historical figures were brothers, sons of a single father, motivated by a shared desire for vengeance. And to examine that claim, we must look more closely at what the contemporary sources actually say about the relationships among the leaders of the great heathen army and what they conspicuously failed to say. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our most detailed English source, names Ivar and Halfdan as leaders of the army and describes them operating together in the early stages of the invasion. It does not call them brothers. Later entries in the Chronicle mention Halfdan's activities in Northumbria and his death in Ireland without reference to Ivar. Guthrum, who led the army's later campaigns against Wessex, is never connected to Ivar or Halfdan by kinship. The Chronicle treats these as separate individuals who commanded the same army at different times, not as members of a dynastic enterprise pursuing a family vendetta. The Irish annals provide a slightly different picture. The Annals of Ulster record the death of Imhar in 873, and in a later entry mention the arrival of his sons in Ireland. The Fragmentary Annals of Ireland, a problematic source that mixes historical material with literary embellishment, provide more detailed accounts of Viking activities in Ireland and Scotland, including references to figures that may correspond to characters in the Ragnar Saga tradition. But the Fragmentary Annals are themselves a composite text, compiled centuries after the events they describe, and their reliability is debated among scholars. With the most tantalizing Irish connection comes through the figure of Imhar and his relationship to the dynasty that controlled Viking Dublin. Imhar is the founder of what historians call the Ui Imir, the dynasty of Ivar, which dominated the Irish Sea region for over a century. This dynasty produced kings of Dublin, kings of York, and power brokers whose influence extended from Scandinavia to the Irish Midlands. The very existence of a dynasty named after Ivar confirms that he was a figure of extraordinary historical importance, important enough that his descendants defined themselves through his name for generations. But was Ivar's father Ragnar? The Irish sources never say so. They track Imhar's descendants forward in time with considerable care, but say nothing about his ancestry. The genealogical connection to Ragnar is imposed entirely by the later Saga tradition, and the Irish evidence neither confirms nor contradicts it. It simply does not address the question. This silence is maddening, but it is also informative. It tells us that whatever the truth of Ragnar's existence, the connection between Ragnar and the historical sons was not common knowledge among the contemporaries who documented those sons' activities. If the great heathen army had publicly proclaimed itself an instrument of vengeance for Ragnar Lothbrok, it is difficult to explain why no contemporary English, Irish, or Frankish source mentions this motivation. The vengeance narrative appears only in later Norse sources. He composed in a literary tradition that had every incentive to impose dramatic coherence on the chaotic reality of 9th century Viking warfare. There is, however, one piece of evidence that complicates this neat skepticism. A single reference buried in a text that most discussions of the Ragnar question overlook. Around the year 1000, a chronicler working in the tradition of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, possibly at the monastery of Peterborough, inserted a note into the Chronicle's entry for 865 that identifies the leaders of the great heathen army as the sons of Lothbrok. This interpolation is not part of the original 9th century text. It was added roughly a century and a half after the events, presumably based on oral tradition or a now lost written source, but it demonstrates that by the end of the 10th century, the connection between the great heathen army and a figure called Lothbrok was established in English memory, not just Norse memory. The legend had crossed cultural boundaries. A similar cross-cultural trace appears in the work of the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing around 1200. Saxo was not working from Norse saga tradition alone. He had access to Danish oral traditions, to Latin scholarly works, and possibly to English sources as well. His account of Ragnar differs substantially from the Icelandic sagas in ways that suggest independent lines of transmission, the stories reaching him through different channels than those that carried them to Iceland. The existence of multiple partially independent lines of tradition does not prove that Ragnar was real. Nasku. But it does suggest that the legend was not the invention of a single storytelling tradition. It emerged simultaneously in multiple cultures that had contact with the events, Scandinavian, English, Irish, which is what we would expect if the legend had some kernel of historical reality, however distorted by transmission. The scholarly consensus, to the extent that one exists, might be summarized as follows. There was probably a historical figure, or possibly 2 or 3 historical figures, whose deeds contributed to the Ragnar legend. The most likely candidate is the Viking leader called Ragnar in the Frankish sources, who led the raid on Paris in 845. This man may have been the father of some of the historical figures later identified as Ragnar's sons, though the evidence for this is circumstantial at best. Over the following centuries, the oral tradition accumulated additional material around this figure, exploits originally attributed to other leaders, mythological connections to the Volsung cycle, the dragon-slaying episode, the Extraordinary Wives, until the historical kernel was buried beneath layers of legendary accretion so thick that excavating the original has become, and may remain, impossible. The process was not unique to Ragnar. The same legendary accretion can be observed in other figures of the Viking Age. Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, whom the sagas make Ragnar's father-in-law through Aslaug, is himself a composite figure blending historical echoes with mythological archetypes. The Ragnar legend participated in a wider pattern of Norse storytelling, in which historical memory and mythological imagination were not opposed but intertwined, each enriching the other, each making the other more powerful. But if the scholarly conclusion sounds like a comfortable compromise, Ragnar was sort of real and sort of legendary, it carries implications that are more radical than they first appear. Because if Ragnar is a composite, then the entire framework through which we understand the Viking Age's most consequential event, the great heathen army's invasion of England, rests on a narrative foundation that may be fundamentally misleading. The vengeance motive, the brotherhood of the sons, the snake pit, The blood eagle, all the dramatic elements that give the invasion its narrative shape in both medieval and modern retellings, may be retrospective impositions, stories told to make sense of events that were in reality driven by more prosaic forces, political opportunism, economic calculation, the structural weakness of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the internal dynamics of Scandinavian power politics. The real causes of the great heathen army's invasion were almost certainly more complex and less dramatic than the saga tradition suggests. The mid-9th century saw an intensification of Viking military activity across all of Western Europe that was driven by large-scale factors: the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire, the development of more sophisticated Norse military organization, the increasing profitability of the slave trade, the establishment of permanent Viking bases in Ireland and Scotland that provided staging grounds for attacks on England. The invasion of 865 was not an aberration. It was the culmination of a decades-long escalation, and it would have happened whether or not a man named Ragnar had ever lived or died. This does not diminish the power of the story. If anything, it enhances it. The fact that a culture could transform the messy, multifactorial reality of historical causation into a narrative of such clarity and emotional force, a murdered father, vengeful sons, a kingdom brought to its knees by the weight of a blood debt, tells us something profound about the human need for story, for meaning, for the belief that great events must have great causes, that catastrophe must be personal, that the destruction of nations cannot be merely the result of economic trends and political miscalculation, but must spring from the deepest wells of human feeling: love, loyalty, and the sacred obligation to avenge the dead. The Norse understood this need. They built their entire culture around it. And in Ragnar Lothbrok, they created a figure perfectly calibrated to satisfy it. A man whose life embodied every value their society held dear, and whose death set in motion consequences that shook the foundations of the known world. Whether that man was one person or many, whether his snake pit was a Northumbrian dungeon or a storyteller's invention, the world he left behind was real. The sons who carried his name or were given his name by later tradition has carved that reality into the soil and stone of England with their swords. And the civilization that emerged from the wreckage they created, the hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture of the Danelaw, the unified English kingdom that Alfred's descendants built from the ruins, the very language in which this story is being told. All of it bears the mark of the events that the saga tradition traces back to one man's death and his son's terrible promise. The piglets had grunted, and the world would never be the same. But the story of Ragnar's legacy does not end with the fall of English kingdoms or the establishment of the Danelaw. The legend had further to travel, to grew across centuries across the sea to Iceland, and into the hands of the men who would give it its final and most enduring form. The saga writers of medieval Iceland, working in stone-walled farmhouses during the long Arctic winters, would take the scattered threads of the Ragnar tradition and weave them into something that transcended history, transcended legend, and became something closer to myth. And in doing so, they would raise questions about memory, identity, and the nature of truth itself that remain as urgent today as they were 800 years ago. To understand what they created and why it still resonates in an age of television adaptations and archaeological excavations, we must travel to the place where the saga tradition reached its fullest flowering, an island of fire and ice at the edge of the known world where the descendants of Vikings built a literary civilization unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Iceland was, by any rational measure, an impossible place to build a civilization. A volcanic island straddling the mid-Atlantic ridge, roughly the size of Ireland but with a fraction of its habitable land, Iceland offered its settlers a landscape of staggering beauty and brutal indifference. Glaciers covered a tenth of the island's surface. Active volcanoes punctuated the interior with fields of black lava and columns of sulfurous steam. The growing season was short. The winters were long and dark. And the soil, where soil existed at all, was thin and fragile. easily stripped by wind and overgrazing. The surrounding ocean teemed with fish and whales, but its moods were violent and unpredictable, and the distance from Iceland to the nearest inhabited landmass, Norway, roughly 1,000 kilometers to the east, meant that any ship that sailed those waters did so with the knowledge that rescue should disaster strike was a concept that belonged to warmer latitudes. And yet between approximately 870 and 930, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Norse settlers made the crossing and established a society on this improbable foundation. They came primarily from western Norway, though the settlement included significant numbers of Norse colonists from Ireland and Scotland who brought with them Celtic wives, Celtic slaves, and Celtic cultural influences that would subtly shape Icelandic society for centuries. They came for reasons that varied from individual to individual, but that shared a common thread. They were leaving failed political ambitions, leaving blood feuds that had made their homes unsafe, leaving the encroaching centralization of power under Harald Fairhair, whose unification of Norway created a political order that many independent-minded chieftains found intolerable. Iceland was not a destination so much as a refusal, a collective decision by several thousand people that they would rather face glaciers and volcanoes than submit to a king. This founding psychology shaped everything that followed. Iceland developed without monarchy. The settlers established a system of governance based on the thing assembly model they had known in Norway, but refined it into something more elaborate and more formally structured than anything Scandinavia had produced. The Althing, founded around 930 at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the European and North American tectonic plates visibly diverge, became the supreme legislative and judicial body of the Icelandic commonwealth. It met for 2 weeks every summer, drawing chieftains and their followers from across the island to debate law, settle disputes, even hear legal cases, and conduct the social and commercial business that sustained a scattered rural society through the rest of the year. The Althing was presided over by the law speaker, an elected official whose primary duty was to recite the entire body of Icelandic law from memory over the course of his 3-year term, 1/3 each summer. In a society without written law codes, Iceland did not commit its laws to writing until 1117. The law speaker's memory was the law. This reliance on memory as institutional infrastructure was not unique to legal matters. It permeated every aspect of Icelandic cultural life. Genealogies were maintained in memory. Historical events were preserved in memory. The poetry of the scalds, the mythological traditions, the heroic legends all existed as oral texts, being stored in the minds of individuals who had inherited them from teachers who had inherited them from teachers before them, in chains of transmission that stretched back to the settlement period and beyond, to the Scandinavian homelands that the settlers had left behind. It was this culture of memory that made Iceland the unlikely vessel in which the literary traditions of the entire Norse world would be preserved. When other Scandinavian societies converted to Christianity and gradually abandoned or suppressed their pre-Christian cultural heritage, Iceland converted too. In the year 1000, by a decision of the Althing that is one of the most remarkable events in the history of religion. But the transition was negotiated rather than imposed. Pagan practices were permitted to continue in private. The old stories were not burned or banned. And they continued to circulate in oral tradition alongside the new Christian learning that the church brought with it. And when Icelanders began writing in the vernacular in the 12th century, they wrote down both the Christian histories and the pagan legends, the saints' lives and the sagas, the Latin theology and the skaldic verse. The result was a literary culture of astonishing range and quality. Between roughly 1150 and 1400, Icelandic writers produced the poetic Edda, our primary source for Norse mythology. The prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, which systematized that mythology for literary purposes, the King's Sagas, which narrated the histories of the Norwegian and Danish royal houses, the family sagas, which told the stories of the original Icelandic settlers and their descendants, and the legendary sagas, the Fornaldarsogur, which reached back beyond the settlement period into the semi-mythological past of the Migration Age and the Heroic Age, the world of dragon slayers and Valkyries, of cursed treasure and doomed love, of Sigurd and Brynhild, of Ragnar and Aslaug. It is in this last category that the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok belongs. The Fornaldarsögur, literally, sagas of ancient times, are the most problematic of all saga genres for the historian because they are the most distant from verifiable events and the most saturated with legendary and mythological material. A family saga like Njál's Saga or Egil's Saga, while not a documentary record, at least describes events that took place in a known landscape within a recoverable historical framework. A king's saga like Heimskringla, while shaped by political bias and literary convention, at least engages with figures and events that appear in independent sources. But a Fornaldarsaga occupies territory where history and myth have merged so thoroughly that separating them requires tools that the literary tradition itself never intended to provide. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, composed probably in the mid-13th century by an unknown Icelandic author, is a text that knows exactly what it is doing. It is not naive. It is not confused about the boundary between history and legend. It simply does not care about that boundary because the boundary is irrelevant to its purpose. Its purpose is to tell the story of the most magnificent Viking who ever lived, to connect that story to the deepest mythological traditions of the Norse world, and to explain how the events of the heroic past produced the political realities of the present. It accomplishes all three objectives with considerable literary skill. The saga begins not with Ragnar, but with his future wife Aslaug, and the choice is deliberate. Aslaug's story connects the Ragnar legend backward in time to the Volsung cycle, the most prestigious heroic tradition in all of Germanic literature. Aslaug is presented as the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the Valkyrie Brynhild, orphaned after her parents' deaths and raised in obscurity by a man named Hymir, who hides the infant inside his harp to conceal her identity. When Hymir is murdered by a peasant couple who suspect the harp contains treasure, they discover not gold but a child of extraordinary beauty, whom they raise as their own under the name Kreka, Crow. This opening sequence accomplishes something structurally essential. By anchoring Ragnar's wife, and therefore Ragnar's sons within the Volsung lineage, the saga writer connects the entire Ragnar tradition to the mythological bedrock of Norse culture. Sigurd the Dragon Slayer was the Norse equivalent of Achilles or King Arthur, the supreme hero whose story defined the culture's highest aspirations. Making Ragnar's wife Sigurd's daughter and Ragnar's sons Sigurd's grandsons elevated the Ragnar legend from the merely historical to the mythologically inevitable. These were not just powerful men, they were the inheritors of the most potent bloodline in the Norse imagination, carrying the Dragon Slayer's legacy into the historical world. The saga's account of Ragnar's life follows the pattern we have already outlined: the dragon slaying, the marriages, the raids, the sons, the final voyage to England, the snake pit, the death poem, the vengeance. But what we have not yet examined closely is the saga's treatment of the psychological and emotional dimensions of Ragnar's story, because it is here that the literary achievement is most impressive and most revealing. The Ragnar of the saga is not a simple heroic archetype. He is a man driven by a specific and ultimately self-destructive compulsion, the need to surpass. His first great deed, the slaying of the dragon that coiled around Thora's bower, establishes a standard that he will spend the rest of his life trying to exceed. Each subsequent achievement, the raids, the conquests, the marriages to extraordinary women, is measured against what came before, and each falls slightly short of the impossible standards set by that first miraculous triumph. The saga dramatizes this through Ragnar's relationship with his sons, who grow into warriors of such prowess that Ragnar begins to feel eclipsed by his own offspring. This is the psychological engine that drives Ragnar to his death. In the saga's account, Ragnar decides to invade England with a deliberately insufficient force, only 2 ships, against the advice of Aslaug, who warns him of the danger. because he cannot bear the thought that his son's deeds will overshadow his own. It is a decision born not of strategic calculation, but of wounded pride. The aging warrior's refusal to accept that the world has moved on, that the next generation has surpassed him, that his greatest days lie behind him. The invasion is, in psychological terms, a suicide mission, an attempt to accomplish something so extraordinary with so few resources that even his sons will be forced to acknowledge their father's supremacy. The saga writer understood something that modern storytellers often forget. A hero's fatal flaw must be inseparable from his heroic virtue. Ragnar's pride is not a corruption of his character, it is his character. The same drive that made him slay the dragon, that made him sail against impossible odds, that made him the most famous Viking of his generation. The quality that made him great is the quality that kills him. This is not a modern psychological insight grafted onto medieval material. It is embedded in the saga's narrative structure, invisible in the choices the author makes about which episodes to include, how to frame them, and where to place the moments of crisis and decision. Aslau's role in the saga deserves particular attention because she is one of the most complex female characters in medieval European literature. She is not a passive figure. She is consistently presented as Ragnar's intellectual equal and, in matters of wisdom and foresight, his superior. When Ragnar first sends for her, she solves his riddle with an ingenuity that demonstrates she is more than a peasant beauty. She is a thinker, a strategist, a woman whose mind operates on multiple levels simultaneously. When Ragnar considers marrying a Swedish princess to forge a political alliance, Aslaug reveals her true parentage in asserting her royal blood and superior lineage with a confidence that borders on arrogance. When Ragnar plans his fatal expedition to England, it is Aslaug who sees the danger clearly and warns him against it. The saga presents Aslaug as the custodian of supernatural wisdom, the inheritor of her parents' connection to the mythological realm. She possesses a kind of foresight that is not precisely magical, but that operates on a plane of understanding unavailable to the men around her. When she warns Ragnar about the English expedition, she is not guessing. She knows. And Ragnar's refusal to listen to her is presented not merely as masculine stubbornness, but as a specific form of blindness. The inability of the warrior ethos to accommodate wisdom that comes from outside its own framework of glory-seeking and competitive honor. This tension between masculine action and feminine wisdom runs through the entire saga and gives it a thematic depth that transcends its surface narrative of raids and battles. The saga is not simply celebrating the warrior ideal, it is examining it, testing it, exploring its limitations. Ragnar's death is not presented as a triumph despite the defiant death poem. It is presented as the inevitable consequence of a value system that cannot accommodate the passage of time, that has no mechanism for aging gracefully, that can only end in destruction because it recognizes no form of achievement that does not involve surpassing what came before. This is extraordinarily sophisticated literary work, and it raises a question that scholars have debated for centuries. How much of this psychological complexity was present in the oral tradition? And how much was added by the 13th century saga writer? The question is ultimately unanswerable, but it matters because it shapes how we understand the relationship between oral memory and literary creation. If the psychological depth was always there, embedded in the oral tradition from the beginning, refined and transmitted across generations of storytelling, then the saga writer was a recorder, however creative, of something genuinely old. If the complexity was added by the writer, then the saga is a work of 13th century literary art that uses 9th century material as raw material for its own purposes. The truth almost certainly lies somewhere between these poles. The oral tradition would have preserved the basic narrative elements: the dragon, the wives, the sons, the snake pit, and the death poem, Fartur, in forms sufficiently stable to survive centuries of transmission. The skaldic verse tradition, with its rigid metrical structures, would have preserved specific phrases, images, and narrative moments with remarkable fidelity. But the overall shaping of the narrative, the psychological architecture, the thematic coherence, the structural parallels and ironies, these bear the marks of a conscious literary intelligence working with inherited material and transforming it into something new. The saga writer was, in other words, doing what Homer did with the Trojan War tradition, what the Beowulf poet did with the Geatish legends, what the authors of the Arthurian romances did with the Celtic mythological inheritance. He was taking a body of traditional material that had been circulating for centuries in oral form, even material that contained genuine historical echoes overlaid with legendary and mythological accretions, and he was giving it the shape of a coherent narrative informed by the literary sensibilities and intellectual concerns of his own time. The product was neither history nor fiction, but something that could only exist in a culture where the distinction between the two had never been drawn with the sharpness that modernity demands. And this brings us to the man who did more than anyone else to shape how we understand the Norse literary tradition, a man who was himself a figure of Ragnar-like complexity, a politician, a scholar, a power broker, and a murder victim whose life and death embody the very tensions between ambition and wisdom that the Ragnar Saga explores. Snorri Sturluson was born in 1179 into one of the most powerful families in Iceland, at a moment when Icelandic society was tearing itself apart. The commonwealth that had governed the island for 2.5 centuries was in its death throes, consumed by escalating feuds among a handful of dominant families who competed for power with increasing ruthlessness. Snorri grew up in this world of political violence and literary brilliance. The two were not separate in 13th century Iceland, but deeply intertwined, each feeding the other. The same chieftains who plotted against their rivals and schemed for territorial advantage were also the patrons and practitioners of scaldic poetry, the commissioners and consumers of saga literature, the keepers of genealogical and historical knowledge that legitimized their claims to power. Snorri was fostered at Adi, the most distinguished center of learning in Iceland, where he received an education that encompassed both the Latin learning of the church and the vernacular traditions of Norse poetry and legend. He emerged from this education as perhaps the most broadly learned man in medieval Scandinavia, equally at home in Christian theology and pagan mythology, in Latin prose style and the intricacies of drotkvet metra, in the political maneuvering of the Icelandic chieftain class, and the literary ambitions of a writer who saw himself as the inheritor and systematizer of an entire cultural tradition. His literary output was extraordinary. The Prose Edda, composed around 1220, is a handbook of Norse mythology and poetic technique that preserved for posterity mythological narratives that might otherwise have been lost. Without Snorri, our knowledge of Odin's sacrifice on Yggdrasil, of Thor's fishing for the world serpent, of the death of Balder, and the prophecy of Ragnarok would be fragmentary at best. Snorri did not invent these stories. He collected, organized, and presented them in a framework designed to make them accessible to a new generation of poets who might otherwise have lost the ability to understand the mythological references that pervaded older skaldic verse. Heimskringla, his history of the Norwegian kings from mythological origins to the 12th century, is one of the great historiographical achievements of the medieval world, a narrative that combines political analysis, our psychological insight, and literary artistry in a way that few historians of any period have matched. Snorri's kings are not icons or abstractions. They are recognizable human beings, proud, ambitious, foolish, courageous, petty, magnificent, driven by the same mixture of rational calculation and irrational passion that drives political actors in every era. Snorri did not write the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. The saga is anonymous, and there is no evidence linking it to Snorri's workshop. But Snorri's intellectual project, the preservation and systematization of Norse literary tradition, created the cultural conditions in which the Ragnar Saga could be written. His Prose Edda provided the mythological framework. His Heimskringla provided the historiographical model. His demonstration that vernacular Norse material could be treated with the same seriousness and literary ambition as Latin scholarship opened the door for other writers to tackle the legendary material of the Fornaldarsögur with comparable sophistication. Snorri's own death, in 1241 at the hands of assassins sent by the Norwegian king Håkon Håkonarsson, was a grim demonstration of the same dynamics that the Ragnar legend dramatized. Snorri had spent decades navigating the intersection of Icelandic and Norwegian politics, making and breaking alliances, accumulating wealth and power, promising loyalty to the Norwegian crown while pursuing his own interests. When his political maneuvering finally failed him, the consequences were fatal. According to the later account, when the assassins found him in the cellar of his estate at Reykholt, Snorri's last words were, "Do not strike." They struck. The greatest literary mind of medieval Scandinavia died as many of the figures in his own histories had died, caught between competing loyalties destroyed by the political system he had tried to manipulate. The irony would not have been lost on the man who had spent his life studying how the Norse told stories about power, ambition, and the fatal consequences of overreaching. Snorri understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the line between the man who lived the story and the man who told the story was thinner than either would have liked to admit. But Snorri's death and the broader collapse of the Icelandic commonwealth in the mid-13th century did not end the saga tradition. If anything, the political turmoil accelerated literary production. He says writers worked to preserve the cultural heritage they could see slipping away. The submission of Iceland to the Norwegian crown in 1262 ended the Commonwealth's independence, and with it, the political system that had sustained the chieftain class and its literary patronage. But the manuscripts continued to be produced, copied, and circulated throughout the 14th century and beyond, preserved in farmhouses and churches across Iceland by families who understood, even if they could not have articulated it in these terms, that the texts they guarded were the memory of a civilization. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was part of this preserved inheritance. It survived in several manuscript copies, the most important being the manuscript known as NKS 1824b42, now housed in the Royal Library in Copenhagen, one of the many Icelandic manuscripts that were collected and removed from Iceland during the 17th and 18th centuries by Danish antiquarians, a cultural extraction that Icelanders have been seeking to reverse with considerable success ever since. The saga was first printed in 1829 and has been translated into numerous languages, making the story of Ragnar available to audiences far beyond the Old Norse reading scholarly community. But for centuries before the printed editions, the Ragnar legend lived in a form that no manuscript could fully capture, in the continuing oral tradition of Scandinavia, in the folk memories and popular tales that persisted alongside the written sagas and that sometimes preserved details and variants not found in any surviving text. The image of Ragnar in the snake pit, composing his death poem while the venom ate through his flesh, became one of the iconic scenes of Norse popular culture. Reproduced in wood carvings, referenced in ballads, invoked in proverbs. In Denmark and Sweden, where the Ragnar legend carried dynastic as well as cultural significance, the story was woven into national narratives of origin and identity that persisted into the modern period. The relationship between the written sagas and the continuing oral tradition is itself a subject of scholarly debate. Did the written text kill the oral tradition by fixing a single authoritative version? Or did oral and written versions continue to coexist and influence each other for centuries? The evidence suggests the latter. Saga manuscripts were not silent texts read in private. Either they were read aloud, it seemed. The Icelandic term for this practice, kvöldvaka, literally evening waking, describes the custom of reading sagas aloud during the long winter evenings while household members worked at their crafts. The manuscript was a script for performance, not a substitute for it. And in performance, the reader could adjust, embellish, and supplement the written text with material from their own oral knowledge, creating a constantly evolving hybrid that was neither purely oral nor purely written. This means that the Ragnar legend, even after it was committed to writing, remained a living tradition rather than a fixed text. Different communities knew different versions. Different readers emphasized different episodes. The written saga was a crystallization of one moment in the tradition's long life, not a definitive statement of what the tradition contained. Other moments, earlier oral versions, later folk retellings, variants preserved in other manuscripts, existed simultaneously, each offering a slightly different Ragnar, each preserving and distorting the tradition in its own way. The implications for our central question are significant. When we ask, did Ragnar Lothbrok exist? We are asking a question that assumes a single unified Ragnar whose existence can be confirmed or denied. But the tradition itself never contained a single Ragnar. It contained a multitude of Ragnars, the Ragnar of the Icelandic Saga, the Ragnar of Saxo Grammaticus, the Ragnar implied by the Frankish annals, the Ragnar remembered in Danish folk tradition, the Ragnar constructed by modern historians from the fragmentary evidence of the sons. These Ragnars overlap but do not coincide. They share a name, certain key episodes, and a general narrative arc, but they differ in details that would be trivial in a fictional character and devastating in a historical one. Which Ragnar are we asking about? The one who slew a dragon and married a Valkyrie's daughter? He did not exist. Not because the saga says he did, but because dragons and Valkyries do not exist, and the episodes that involve them are transparently mythological. The one who raided Paris in 845? He may well have existed. The Frankish sources attest to a real Viking leader who did real things in a real place at a real time. The one who fathered Ivar, Halfdan, Björn, and Sigurd? Possibly. The sons existed, and sons require fathers. And though whether all four shared a single father named Ragnar is precisely the question that cannot be answered from the available evidence. The one who died in a snake pit composing a death poem of transcendent defiance? Almost certainly not. Duskimu. The death scene has the hallmarks of literary composition rather than historical report. And the Krakumal, the death poem attributed to Ragnar, is demonstrably a 12th century creation. The honest answer to the question, did Ragnar Lothbrok exist, may therefore be, which Ragnar and what do you mean by exist? This is not evasion, it is precision. The modern mind, trained by centuries of historical methodology to think of existence as a binary, a person either lived or did not, struggles with figures who occupy the boundary between history and legend. We want a clear answer, yes or no. Real or invented? The evidence refuses to cooperate, and perhaps that refusal is itself the most important thing the Ragnar legend has to teach us. Not about the Viking Age, but about the nature of historical knowledge itself. About the limitations of our certainty. About the vast stretches of human experience that lie beyond the reach of documentation, preserved only in the imperfect, creative, self-serving, beautiful, and fundamentally unreliable medium of story. The Ragnar question forces us to confront a truth that professional historians know but rarely state plainly. For most of human history, we do not know what happened. We know what people said happened, which is a very different thing. The written record that we call history is not a window onto the past. It is a construction, built by specific people with specific purposes using specific methods of selection, emphasis, and omission. The Frankish monks who recorded Reganhari's raid on Paris were not objective journalists. They were members of a religious institution that had been attacked by pagans, and they wrote about that attack in a framework shaped by their theological convictions, their political loyalties, and their literary conventions. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers who documented the great heathen army were not neutral observers. They were writing during or shortly after a period of existential crisis, and their accounts are shaped by the same mixture of patriotism, religious conviction, and political agenda that shapes war reporting in every era. The saga writers, at least, were honest about what they were doing, and they were telling stories. They drew on memory and tradition, on poetry and genealogy, on the accumulated cultural inheritance of their society, and they shaped these materials into narratives that served the needs of their audience and their time. They did not claim to be writing history in the modern sense. That claim was imposed on them retrospectively by later readers who wanted the sagas to be something they were never intended to be, transparent windows onto a recoverable past. The Ragnar legend, understood in this light, is not a failure of historical knowledge. It is an achievement of cultural memory, a demonstration of how a society that lacked written records could nevertheless preserve across centuries a coherent and emotionally powerful account of its own past. And that account is not accurate in the way that a modern historical monograph aspires to be accurate. It is accurate in a different way, accurate to the values, the fears, the aspirations, and the self-understanding of the people who created and transmitted it. It tells us what the Norse thought mattered about their own history, and what they thought mattered was not the economic factors behind Viking expansion, or the political calculations that drove military campaigns, or the demographic pressures that pushed settlers across the Atlantic. What mattered was the story, the man, the deed, the death, the vengeance, the father in the snake pit, the sons on the shore of England, the blood debt paid in full. And this understanding of the saga tradition as cultural memory rather than failed history does not resolve the question of Ragnar's existence, but it reframes the question in a way that makes it more productive. Instead of asking, was Ragnar real? We might ask, what reality did Ragnar preserve? What historical experiences, what cultural values, what collective memories are encoded in the legend? And what can we learn about the past by reading the legend not as a flawed record of events, but as a faithful record of how a culture understood those events? This is the approach that the most sophisticated modern scholarship has adopted, and it has yielded insights that the simple binary of real or fake could never produce. The Ragnar legend preserves genuine memories of the Viking expansion, the raids on Francia, the invasion of England, the establishment of Scandinavian power across the North Atlantic. It preserves genuine social dynamics, the competition between fathers and sons, the tension between individual glory and collective survival, the role of women as custodians of wisdom and lineage in a warrior society. It preserves genuine religious and philosophical convictions, the fatalism, the cult of reputation, the belief that a good death could redeem a flawed life. And it preserves, perhaps most valuably, a genuine insight into how pre-literate societies constructed their relationship with the past, not through documentation, but through story, not through evidence, but through meaning. The Ragnar legend is, in the end, a mirror. What it reflects depends on who is looking into it and what they are looking for. The medieval Icelander saw a heroic ancestor and a model for living. The Victorian antiquarian saw a romantic barbarian and a symbol of Nordic racial vitality. The modern historian sees a case study in the construction of legendary tradition. The television viewer sees a compelling character in a dramatic narrative. Each of these reflections is partial, and each is shaped by the needs and assumptions of the viewer. None of them is Ragnar, all of them are Ragnar. The legend accommodates them all because it was built to accommodate Imalwaimiarquiyus, built by a tradition that valued adaptability and resonance over fixity and precision. But there is one more chapter in the Ragnar story that must be told before we can draw even provisional conclusions. The legend did not stop evolving when the last Saga manuscript was copied. It continued to change, to grow, to adapt to new circumstances and new audiences across the centuries that separated the medieval world from our own. And the most dramatic transformation of all, the one that made Ragnar Lothbrok a household name in the 21st century, known to millions who have never read a saga or opened a history book, is a transformation that would have consequences the saga writers could never have imagined. The Ragnar legend was about to enter the modern world, and the modern world, it turned out, was hungry for Vikings. The rediscovery of the Viking Age by modern Europe was not a sudden event, but a slow awakening, a process that unfolded across 3 centuries, and that was shaped at every stage by the political, intellectual, and emotional needs of the societies doing the rediscovering. The Vikings that emerged from this process bore only a partial resemblance to the people who had actually lived in 9th century Scandinavia. They were, in a sense, a second legend, built on top of the first using the saga tradition as raw material but reshaping it according to imperatives that the saga writers would not have recognized. The process began in Scandinavia itself, in the 16th and 17th centuries when Danish and Swedish scholars turned to the medieval past as a source of national prestige. The Reformation had severed Scandinavia's cultural ties to Rome, and the new Protestant kingdoms needed a usable past that did not depend on the authority of the Catholic Church. The Viking Age, pagan, independent, militarily triumphant, offered exactly what was needed. Danish antiquarians like Ole Worm, who published the first printed edition of runic inscriptions in 1636, and Swedish scholars like Olof Rudbeck, whose deliriously ambitious Atlantica attempted to prove that Sweden was the original Atlantis and the cradle of all civilization, mined the saga tradition for evidence of Scandinavian greatness. Their work was scholarship in the sense that it involved the collection and publication of primary sources, many of which might otherwise have been lost. But it was also nationalism, the construction of a glorious past to serve the political needs of the present. Ragnar Lothbrok occupied a prominent place in this early modern Scandinavian revival, and as the legendary ancestor of the Danish royal house, through the genealogical traditions that trace the Jelling dynasty back to Sigurd's snake in the eye and thence to Ragnar, he served as a foundation stone of Danish national identity. The Krikumal, Ragnar's supposed death poem, was published in Latin translation in 1636 and quickly became one of the most widely cited texts of Old Norse literature, admired for its defiant tone and its vivid evocation of the warrior ethos. For 17th century readers accustomed to classical models of heroism, Ragnar's death scene offered a northern alternative, a hero who faced his end not with stoic resignation, but with fierce, almost joyful defiance, raising his voice against death itself and declaring his confidence that the gods awaited him with honor. The Krakumal's reception illustrates a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the modern history of the Ragnar legend. Each generation found in the material what it needed to find. The 17th century antiquarians found national prestige. The 18th century romantics found noble savagery. The 19th century nationalists found racial destiny, and each generation's reading, while genuinely engaging with the source material, also distorted it, emphasizing certain elements, suppressing others, and filling the gaps in the evidence with assumptions drawn from contemporary ideology rather than historical analysis. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was particularly consequential for the Viking image. The Romantics, reacting against the rationalism of the Enlightenment, were drawn to cultures that seemed to embody passion, authenticity, and a direct connection to nature that civilized European society had lost. The Norse world, as filtered through the Sagas and the Eddas, offered all of this in abundance. The howling storms, the icy seas, the warriors who laughed at death and loved with the same intensity that they fought. These images resonated powerfully with a generation that valued feeling over reason and the sublime over the beautiful. Thomas Percy's translation of Paul-Henri Mallet's work on Norse mythology, published in English in 1770 as Northern Antiquities, introduced the Viking world to a broad British readership and sparked a fascination that would persist for over a century. The image of the Viking that emerged from this period, the horned helmeted barbarian, the berserker frothing with battle rage, the longship prow cutting through fog-shrouded seas, owed as much to romantic imagination as to historical evidence. The horned helmets, for instance, are a pure invention of the 19th century. No archaeological evidence supports their use by Vikings in any period. They were added to the image by costume designers and illustrators who needed a visual shorthand for fierce northerner, and who borrowed the horned motif from Bronze Age Scandinavian artifacts that predated the Viking Age by 2,000 years. The image was false, but it was vivid, and vividness, in the economy of cultural memory, always defeats accuracy. The 19th century brought the Viking revival to its full intensity driven by the twin engines of nationalism and imperialism. In Scandinavia, the Viking Age became the centerpiece of national identity movements in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, each country claiming the most prestigious elements of the shared heritage for itself. The discovery and excavation of Viking ship burials, the Gokstad ship in 1880, the Oseberg ship in 1904, provided tangible, awe-inspiring physical evidence that the saga traditions were rooted in a real material culture of extraordinary sophistication. Museums were built to house these finds, and they became pilgrimage sites for a public eager to commune with an ancestral past that seemed grander, more vital, and more authentically northern than the domesticated present. In Britain, the Viking heritage carried a different but equally powerful charge. The Danelaw, the Scandinavian settlement of eastern England, had left a permanent mark on English language, culture, and genetics. Victorian scholars and popular writers constructed narratives in which the Viking contribution to English civilization was presented as a racial infusion, the injection of Nordic vigor into an Anglo-Saxon stock that had grown soft and complacent. This racial reading of the Viking legacy, which now strikes the modern ear as repugnant, was entirely mainstream in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It drew on the same intellectual currents that produced scientific racism, social Darwinism, and the broader European obsession with racial classification and hierarchy. The Vikings, in this framework, were not merely historical actors, but biological archetypes, exemplars of a northern racial spirit characterized by courage, independence, physical vigor, and an innate capacity for self-governance. Ragnar Lothbrok served this ideology well. His legendary biography, The Dragon Slaying, The Conquest of Kingdoms, The Defiant Death, could be read as a parable of racial excellence, the triumph of the strong over the weak, the natural superiority of the northern warrior over the decadent civilizations he conquered. That this reading required the systematic suppression of everything the saga tradition actually said about Ragnar. His fatal pride, his self-destructive competitiveness, the complex moral landscape of the Norse world that the sagas presented with such sophistication, mattered not at all. The ideological need consumed the nuance, as ideological need always does. The appropriation of Norse symbolism by the Nazi regime in the 1930s and 1940s represented the darkest expression of this racial reading. The SS adopted runic insignia. Nazi ideologues constructed elaborate pseudo-historical narratives about the racial purity and martial superiority of the ancient Germanic peoples. The Viking warrior became an icon of the Aryan ideal, the blue-eyed, blonde-haired conqueror whose dominance was ordained by blood. This appropriation was not merely offensive, it was intellectually fraudulent, resting on a fundamental misunderstanding of Norse society, which was ethnically diverse, commercially cosmopolitan, and connected through trade and migration to cultures ranging from the Islamic Caliphate to the Byzantine Empire, and a willful distortion of the saga tradition, which consistently presented the warrior ethos as tragic rather than triumphant, a value system that led to beautiful deaths and destroyed societies in roughly equal measure. The shadow of this appropriation lingered over Viking studies for decades after the war. Scholars were understandably wary of a subject that had been so thoroughly contaminated by association with fascist ideology. The popular image of the Viking, meanwhile, split into two competing versions that mapped loosely onto the political divisions of the post-war world. The progressive version emphasized the Vikings as traders, settlers, and cultural innovators. The founders of Dublin, the discoverers of North America, the creators of the first parliamentary institution in Europe. The conservative version retained elements of the martial image, the fierce warriors, the bold explorers, the men who carved kingdoms from hostile wilderness through sheer force of will. Both versions were partial. Both were shaped by contemporary politics rather than historical evidence, and both would be superseded in the early 21st century by a new version that would prove more powerful and more pervasive than anything that had come before. The transformation began, as so many modern cultural transformations do, with television. The History Channel series Vikings, which premiered in March 2013 and ran for 6 seasons over 7 years, did for Ragnar Lothbrok what Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films had done for Tolkien a decade earlier. It took a body of material known primarily to specialists and enthusiasts and made it part of the global cultural conversation. The show's creator, Michael Hurst, he made a deliberate decision to center the series on Ragnar Lothbrok as played by the Australian actor Travis Fimmel, and the result was a portrayal that, whatever its historical merits, was undeniably compelling. Hurst's Ragnar was a departure from every previous version of the character. He was not the saga's aging king driven by competitive pride. He was not the Victorian racial archetype. He was not the romantic noble savage. He was something recognizably modern, a restless, questioning, intellectually curious man trapped in a society that had no mechanism for accommodating his particular kind of ambition. Fimmel's performance emphasized the character's intelligence and emotional complexity, creating a Ragnar who was as likely to be found staring thoughtfully at a horizon as swinging an axe, and the series presented him as a farmer who dreamed of sailing west, a man whose desire to explore and discover put him in conflict with the established power structures of his society. The show's historical accuracy was, by scholarly standards, inconsistent at best. It collapsed centuries of Viking history into a single narrative timeline, placed characters in situations that no contemporary source supports, invented episodes wholesale, and presented the Norse world through a lens that owed as much to 21st century sensibilities as to 9th century realities. The depiction of Viking religion in particular drew criticism from scholars for its oversimplification of a belief system that was far more diverse, localized, and informal than the show's dramatic rituals suggested. But none of this mattered to the show's audience, which grew to millions across multiple continents. What mattered was the story. And the story that Vikings told of a man who challenged the limits of his world, who sought something beyond the horizon, who loved deeply and fought ferociously and died memorably, was a story that resonated with a global audience in ways that no scholarly monograph ever could. The cultural impact was immediate and measurable. Tourism to Scandinavian countries increased. Enrollment in Old Norse language courses spiked at universities across the English-speaking world. Sales of Saga translations, which had been modest and largely confined to academic audiences, surged into the mainstream. Viking-themed merchandise proliferated. Norse mythology, which had been overshadowed for decades by the Greek and Roman traditions in popular culture, experienced a renaissance that extended far beyond the television show itself, feeding into video games, novels, comic books, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Thor franchise, which drew on the same mythological tradition through a very different lens. The Netflix series Vikings, Valhalla, which debuted in 2022, continued the franchise into the next generation, carrying the narrative forward into the 11th century and the final phases of the Viking Age. Other productions followed. Ulkarbikcho, The Last Kingdom, based on Bernard Cornwell's Saxon Stories novels, told the story of the Viking invasions from the Anglo-Saxon perspective, giving audiences a complementary view of the same events. Robert Eggers' film The Northman, released in 2022, offered a deliberately art house approach to Viking material, each drawing directly on the saga tradition, or specifically the legend of Amleth, which also inspired Shakespeare's Hamlet, and presenting the Norse world with a visceral intensity that prioritized atmospheric authenticity over narrative accessibility. The cumulative effect of these adaptations was to make the Viking Age more widely known and more intensely discussed than at any point since the sagas themselves were composed. Ragnar Lothbrok became, by any measure, one of the most famous historical or pseudo-historical figures in the world, his name recognized by people who could not locate Scandinavia on a map and who had never heard of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This explosion of popular interest created a peculiar dynamic in the relationship between scholarship and public understanding. On one hand, the popular adaptations generated enormous enthusiasm for Viking history, driving audiences toward books, museums, and educational content they would never otherwise have encountered. On the other hand, the adaptations shaped public expectations in ways that made genuine historical understanding more difficult. Audiences who came to the Viking Age through the television series arrived with a specific set of assumptions about what Vikings looked like, how they behaved, what they believed, and what their society was like, that were drawn from dramatic fiction rather than historical evidence. The gap between the television Viking and the historical Viking was wide enough to create persistent misconceptions that scholars found themselves spending as much time correcting as they did advancing new knowledge. The Shield Maiden question illustrates this dynamic with particular clarity. The television series prominently featured female warriors, women who fought alongside men in battle, who commanded their own war bands, who achieved martial glory on equal terms with their male counterparts. The character of Lagertha, presented as Ragnar's first wife and a legendary shield maiden, became one of the most popular figures in the series and an icon of empowerment for many female viewers. The saga tradition does mention women who bore arms. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok itself presents Aslog's mother Brynhild as a Valkyrie, and other sagas contain episodes involving female warriors. But the historical evidence for women's regular participation in Viking warfare is thin and contested. In 2017, a study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology announced that a high-status Viking burial at Birka in Sweden, long assumed to contain a male warrior, had been genetically identified as female. The burial contained weapons, a gaming set suggestive of tactical thinking, and 2 horses, all markers traditionally associated with elite male warriors. The finding made international headlines and was widely interpreted as confirmation that shield maidens were real. But the scholarly response was more cautious. Critics pointed out that the presence of weapons in a burial does not necessarily indicate that the buried individual used them in life. Grave goods reflect status, identity, and ideology, not necessarily biography. Others questioned whether a single burial, however spectacular, could be taken as evidence for a widespread practice. The debate continues, with each new archaeological find generating fresh rounds of argument and counter-argument. The broader point is that the modern revival of the Ragnar legend has created a feedback loop between popular culture and scholarly inquiry that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Television shows inspire public interest, which drives funding for archaeological excavations and academic research, which produces findings that are immediately absorbed into the next generation of popular adaptations, which inspire further public interest and so on in an accelerating cycle. The Ragnar legend is no longer a static body of medieval text. It is a living cultural phenomenon, constantly being reinterpreted, constantly generating new questions. He's constantly revealing new dimensions of the past that previous generations failed to notice or chose to ignore. And this brings us to the most recent chapter in the story, the contribution of archaeology, which has, in the past few decades, begun to provide a kind of evidence that neither the sagas nor the chronicles can offer. Evidence that does not speak through the distorting medium of human language. Evidence that lies in the soil itself, waiting to be read by those who know how to listen to dirt and bone and corroded metal. The archaeology of the Viking Age has been transformed in the 21st century by technologies that would have seemed miraculous to the scholars of a generation ago. DNA analysis can determine the geographic origin, sex, and familial relationships of individuals buried 1,000 years ago. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can reveal where a person grew up, what they ate, and how far they traveled during their lifetime. Radiocarbon dating, refined to a precision that earlier decades could not achieve, can place organic materials within narrow chronological windows. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR can reveal the outlines of buried structures, ship burials, and fortifications without turning a single spadeful of earth. Each of these technologies has contributed to a picture of the Viking Age that is simultaneously more detailed and more complex than anything the textual sources alone could provide. For the Ragnar question specifically, the most significant archaeological developments have been those that illuminate the great heathen army and its impact on England. From the discovery in 1982 of a mass burial at Repton in Derbyshire, a site where the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the great heathen army wintering in 873 to 874, provided the first direct physical evidence of the army's presence. The burial contained the remains of at least 264 individuals, predominantly male, of fighting age, many showing evidence of traumatic injury. A particularly striking burial, designated Grave 511, contained a male skeleton interred with a Thor's hammer pendant, a sword, and a jackdaw bone placed between his legs, possibly a symbolic replacement for genitalia that the individual had lost either through injury or through a condition present from birth. Some scholars have noted the possible resonance between Grave 511 and the Saga tradition's description of Ivar the Boneless. The nickname Boneless has never been satisfactorily explained. Interpretations range from a hereditary skeletal condition like osteogenesis imperfecta to a metaphorical reference to impotence to a mistranslation of an Old Norse word meaning detested rather than boneless. The Repton burial raises the tantalizing possibility that Ivar's condition, whatever it was, might have left physical traces that could be identified archaeologically. But the identification of Grave 511 with Ivar remains speculative. The burial is consistent with a high-status Viking warrior of the right period, but consistency is not proof, and the gap between could be and is remains unbridged. More recent work at Repton and at other great heathen army sites has used isotope and DNA analysis to build a demographic profile of the invaders. The results have been surprising. The army was not exclusively Scandinavian. Isotope analysis reveals individuals who grew up in the British Isles, suggesting that the army recruited locally, incorporating disaffected English warriors, Norse settlers already resident in Britain and Ireland, and individuals of mixed heritage who belonged to the hybrid communities that had developed in areas of Scandinavian settlement. DNA analysis has revealed both male and female individuals among the army's dead, challenging the traditional image of an exclusively male fighting force and raising questions about the role of women in the army as camp followers, as settlers accompanying a colonizing force, or possibly, in some cases, as combatants. These findings do not answer the Ragnar question directly. No archaeological discovery has produced an inscription reading, "Here lies Ragnar Lothbrok," or a burial that can be definitively linked to the legendary figure. But they do something equally important. They fill in the world that the Ragnar legend describes, giving it material reality, physical weight, the smell of turned earth and the texture of corroded iron. They show us that the great heathen army was real in a way that goes beyond the textual record, real in the bones of the people who fought in it, real in the soil of the places where they camped and died, real in the chemical signatures locked in their teeth that record the journeys they made across the medieval world. The archaeology also complicates the narrative in ways that the saga tradition never anticipated. The mass burial at Repton includes individuals whose isotope signatures place their origins in Scandinavia, in the British Isles, and in locations that cannot be precisely identified. The army, in other words, was not a homogeneous Scandinavian invasion force, but a polyglot, multi-ethnic military enterprise that drew its members from across the Viking world and beyond. This picture is harder to reconcile with the saga tradition's tidy narrative of Danish brothers avenging a Danish father than it is with the messier historical reality of Viking warfare as a transnational phenomenon driven by opportunity, profit, and the complex dynamics of a warrior culture that transcended individual kingdoms and ethnic identities. The most ambitious recent project to use archaeology to investigate the Ragnar legend directly is the ongoing work at sites associated with the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, the city that the great heathen army captured in 866 and that became the capital of a Norse kingdom that endured in various forms until the mid-10th century. Excavations in York over the past half-century have revealed a Viking Age city of considerable sophistication, a commercial center connected by trade routes to Dublin, to Scandinavia, to the Frankish kingdoms, and through intermediaries to the Islamic world and beyond. Artifacts recovered from Coppergate and other sites in central York include silk from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic, jet from Whitby, and silver from the Abbasid Caliphate, testifying to a web of commercial connections that spanned the known world. This material evidence of Viking York's cosmopolitan character sits uneasily alongside the Saga tradition's portrayal of the city as merely the site of Ælla's execution and the fulfillment of a blood vendetta. The real York was not a backdrop for Norse revenge drama. It was a thriving urban center whose significance extended far beyond its role in the Ragnar legend. The archaeology reminds us that the people who lived in 9th century England, English and Scandinavian alike, were not characters in a saga. They were human beings living complex lives in a complex world, and their concerns extended far beyond the narrative frameworks that later storytelling traditions would impose on their experience. But the archaeology also provides moments of startling convergence between legend and material reality. Moments when the physical evidence seems to confirm, or at least resonate with, specific claims in the textual tradition. The discovery of a Viking Age gaming piece at Torksey in Lincolnshire, another site where the great heathen army is recorded as having camped, bearing a scratched inscription that may include a Norse personal name, is a reminder that the people whose movements we track through the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle were individuals who left physical traces of their passage. Each metal detector find, each excavated hearth, each fragment of pottery or bone brings us fractionally closer to the lived reality of the 9th century, and fractionally further from the clean narrative lines of the saga tradition. The tension between these two modes of understanding the past, or the narrative and the material, the story and the soil, is ultimately irresolvable. They answer different questions. The saga tradition answers the question, what did this mean? The archaeological record answers the question, what actually happened? Both questions are legitimate, both are necessary, neither is sufficient alone. And the Ragnar legend sits precisely at their intersection, a figure who cannot be understood through either mode alone, but who requires both. The story to give him meaning, the soil to give him substance. This dual nature is, paradoxically, what makes Ragnar Lothbrok so valuable as a subject of historical inquiry. He is not a figure who can be settled. He is a figure who forces us to think about how we know what we think we know, about the relationship between evidence and narrative, between documentation and memory, between the past as it was and the past as it has been told. Every generation that has engaged with the Ragnar legend has found itself confronting these questions, and every generation has answered them differently, because the answers depend not just on the evidence but on the assumptions, the values, and the intellectual tools that each generation brings to the inquiry. The Viking Age itself lasted roughly 3 centuries, from the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. When the last great Viking invasion of England ended in the death of the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada at the hands of the English king Harold Godwinson, who himself would die 3 weeks later at the Battle of Hastings, killed by the arrows of William the Conqueror, a man who was himself descended from the Viking settlers of Normandy. The Viking Age, in other words, did not end so much as dissolve into the broader currents of medieval European history, its energies absorbed into the kingdoms, the languages, the legal systems, and the genetic inheritance of the peoples it had transformed. Ragnar Lothbrok, if he lived at all, lived at the midpoint of this transformation, the moment when Viking activity was shifting from opportunistic raiding to systematic conquest, when the Norse were ceasing to be external invaders and becoming permanent features of the Western European political landscape. His legend captured that moment of transition and crystallized it into a single life. The dragon slayer who became a king, the raider who became a conqueror, the pagan who died defying a Christian king. These are not just the episodes of one man's biography. They are the arc of the Viking Age itself, compressed into human form, made personal and immediate and emotionally available in a way that abstract historical processes never can be. This is why the legend has endured, not because it is true, we cannot know if it is true, but because it is meaningful. It encodes real historical experience in a form that human beings can absorb, remember, and transmit. It answers the questions that people actually ask about the past, not what were the economic factors, but what was it like? Not what were the structural causes, but who were these people and what did they want and what happened to them? The Saga tradition understood that these are the questions that matter, and it answered them with a narrative artistry that has outlasted every rival account of the same events. The modern world has not outgrown this need. The success of the television adaptations proves it. The hunger for Viking content or achievement, for shows, for books, for games, for museum exhibitions, for archaeological documentaries, is not a passing fad. It is an expression of the same need that drove the saga writers to compose their narratives in the first place. The need to understand the past through story, to find in the experiences of the dead some illumination of the experience of living. And at the center of that story, still after 12 centuries, stands the figure that may or may not have been a man, the dragon slayer, the sacker of Paris, the father of conquerors, the old boar in the snake pit, smiling as the venom takes him, speaking his last words into the darkness with the certainty that somewhere, far away, his sons are listening. The little piglets will grunt, he said, and we are grunting still. But the question of Ragnar's reality, or unreality, has one final dimension that we have not yet explored. A dimension that takes us beyond the familiar territory of sagas and chronicles and archaeological sites and into the more treacherous landscape of how modern scholarship actually works when confronted with a figure who refuses to be either confirmed or dismissed. The academic debate over Ragnar Lothbrok is not merely a question of evidence, it is a question of method, of what counts as evidence, of how much weight to give different types of sources, of where the burden of proof should fall when the available documentation is fragmentary, contradictory, and contaminated by centuries of legendary elaboration. The historians who have grappled most seriously with the Ragnar problem can be divided broadly into three camps, not by nationality or period, but by their fundamental assumptions about the relationship between legendary tradition and historical reality. Understanding these camps is essential, because the conclusion you reach about Ragnar depends less on which evidence you examine than on which principles you use to evaluate it. The first camp might be called the historicists. These are scholars who believe that the saga tradition, for all its legendary accretions, preserves a genuine historical core that can be recovered through careful analysis. The historicist approach does not accept the sagas at face value. No serious scholar has done so for over a century, but it does maintain that the sagas contain recoverable historical information, and that the task of the historian is to strip away the legendary layers and locate the factual kernel beneath. For the Ragnar question, the historicist position holds that there was a real singular historical figure named Ragnar who performed at least some of the deeds attributed to him, who fathered at least some of the sons the tradition claims, and whose death, in whatever form it actually took, did motivate the great heathen army's invasion of England. The strongest historicist arguments rest on the sons. The logic is straightforward. If Ivar, Halfdan, Björn, and Sigurd were real individuals, and the contemporary sources leave little room for doubt on this point, then they had a father. If multiple independent traditions, Icelandic, Danish, English, identify that father as Ragnar, then the simplest explanation is that a man named Ragnar existed and was, in fact, their father. The alternative, that several unrelated Viking leaders were retrospectively assembled into a fictional family by later storytellers, requires us to explain why the tradition converged on this particular configuration, this particular name, this particular set of relationships when other configurations were equally available. The historicists argue that convergence of this kind is most easily explained by a real historical connection that all the traditions, however imperfectly, are reflecting. The historicist camp also draws strength from the Frankish sources. Reginheri's raid on Paris in 845 is documented by contemporaries. The name is linguistically compatible with Ragnar. The event matches the saga tradition. If we accept, as most scholars do, that Reginheri and Ragnar are the same name, and then we have a documented historical figure performing a documented historical deed that the saga tradition attributes to its protagonist. This does not prove that the saga Ragnar and the historical Reginheri are the same person in the sense of sharing an identical biography, but it does establish that a Norse leader named Ragnar operated in the mid-9th century, which is the minimum historical foundation that the legend requires. The most prominent modern exponent of a broadly historicist approach was the Danish historian Rory McTurk, whose studies in Ragnar's Saga Lothbrok and its major Scandinavian analogues, published in 1991, remains the most comprehensive academic treatment of the Ragnar tradition. McTurk conducted a meticulous analysis of the saga's narrative elements, not tracing each episode to its likely sources and attempting to distinguish between material that could plausibly derive from historical memory and material that was transparently literary or mythological in origin. His conclusion was cautious but broadly historicist. There was probably a historical Ragnar, active in the mid-9th century, whose career provided the nucleus around which the later legend crystallized. McTurk acknowledged that the legend had absorbed material from other sources, other historical figures, mythological traditions, literary motifs borrowed from continental European literature, but he maintained that the nucleus was real, that the name attached to a person rather than a purely fictional creation. The second camp takes the opposite position. These scholars, the skeptics, argue that the evidence for a historical Ragnar is too thin, too late, and too contaminated by legendary tradition to support any confident claim of historicity. The skeptical position does not necessarily assert that no one named Ragnar ever lived. It asserts more precisely that the figure described in the sagas is so thoroughly a product of literary and legendary processes that no historical individual can be meaningfully recovered from the tradition. The Ragnar of the sagas is, in this view, a fictional character, not in the sense that he was invented from nothing, but in the sense that the tradition has transformed whatever historical raw material it began with so completely that the end product bears no reliable relationship to any real person. The skeptical arguments are formidable. The silence of contemporary sources on Ragnar as the father of the great heathen army's leaders is, for the skeptics, the decisive piece of evidence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does not name him. Asser does not name him. The Irish Annals do not name him. The Frankish sources name a Reginheri who dies of disease shortly after the Paris raid, a fate incompatible with the saga tradition's account of Ragnar's death in a Northumbrian snake pit decades later. If Ragnar was the father of the most consequential military force to strike England in the 9th century, and if his sons publicly proclaimed their invasion as an act of vengeance for his death, then the failure of every contemporary source to mention this motivation is, for the skeptics, inexplicable on the assumption that the vengeance narrative is historical. It becomes perfectly explicable, however, if the vengeance narrative was a later invention, a retrospective literary framework imposed on events that were, in reality, driven by more mundane strategic and economic considerations. The skeptics also point to the legendary accretion patterns we have already discussed. The dragon slaying, the Volsung genealogy, the magical shield maiden wives, the impossible chronological span of the attributed deeds. All of these elements are better explained as the products of legendary growth than as reflections of historical reality. The skeptical position holds that the tradition began not with a single historical figure, but with a cluster of separate traditions about separate individuals, a Danish king, a Norse raider, in the father of certain Viking leaders in England and Ireland that gradually merged over time into a single composite figure. The name Ragnar may have belonged to one of these individuals, or it may have been attached to the composite at some point during the merging process. Either way, the composite is not a person. It is a construct. And asking whether the construct existed is like asking whether the color blue exists as a physical object. The question misidentifies the nature of the thing it is asking about. The most influential skeptical voice in recent decades has been the Icelandic historian Ólafía Einarsdóttir, whose work on the chronological problems of the Ragnar tradition demonstrated with devastating clarity that the events attributed to Ragnar in the various sources cannot be fitted into a single human lifetime without violating either the internal chronology of the sagas or the external chronology established by contemporary Frankish and English sources. If Ragnar raided Paris in 845 as a man of military age, say 30 at minimum, then he was born around 815 at the earliest. If he died in England around 865, he would have been approximately 50, which is old but not impossible for the period. But the saga tradition places events in Ragnar's youth that require pushing his birth date back into the late 8th century. And the genealogical traditions that connect him to Sigurd Ring and the Battle of Bravelir require pushing it back further still. The chronology does not work for a single individual. It works perfectly for a composite figure, assembled from the careers of multiple men who operated across a span of several decades. The third camp, and the one that has gained the most ground in recent scholarship, might be called the constructivists. These scholars are less interested in the question of whether Ragnar was real or fictional than in the question of how the legend was constructed, what purposes it served, and what it reveals about the cultures that created and transmitted it. The constructivist approach draws on methodologies from literary theory, anthropology, and the study of oral tradition, and it treats the Ragnar legend not as a problem to be solved, but as a phenomenon to be understood. The constructivist contribution has been to shift the terms of the debate away from the binary of real versus invented, and toward a more nuanced understanding of how legendary figures emerge from historical cultures. The key insight, developed most fully by scholars working in the tradition of oral formulaic theory, is that legendary figures like Ragnar are not invented by individual authors, but generated by cultural processes that operate across generations. The legend is not a lie told by a specific person at a specific moment. It is an emergent property of a storytelling system, the natural product of a culture that preserved its past through narrative rather than documentation. In this framework, we're asking whether Ragnar existed is less useful than asking what conditions produced the legend and what needs the legend served. The constructivists identify several such conditions and needs. First, the dynastic need. The medieval Danish royal house claimed descent from Ragnar through Sigurd's snake in the eye, and this genealogical claim required a prestigious ancestor whose biography could legitimate the dynasty's authority. A composite figure, assembled from the most impressive deeds of the Viking Age, served this purpose far more effectively than any single historical individual could have. Second, the narrative need. The great heathen army's invasion of England was the most consequential event in the Viking Age's impact on the British Isles, and the storytelling tradition required an explanation for why it happened. The vengeance motive, a murdered father avenging sons, provided a narrative framework of extraordinary clarity and emotional power. Third, the cultural need. Norse society valued the exemplary life as its primary form of moral instruction, and the Ragnar legend provided the ultimate exemplary life, a biography that embodied every virtue the culture admired, tested every value the culture held dear, and ended with a death scene that crystallized the entire warrior ethos into a single unforgettable moment. The constructivist approach does not dismiss the possibility that a historical Ragnar existed. It simply argues that the question is less important than it appears, because the legend would have taken essentially the same form regardless of whether its nucleus was a single historical individual, a cluster of historical individuals, or a purely fictional creation. The cultural processes that shaped the legend were powerful enough to transform any starting material, historical or imaginary, into the same end product. The legend is the product of its culture, not of its protagonist. This scholarly landscape, historicists, skeptics, and constructivists, each with compelling arguments, each with significant blind spots, is the terrain that any honest engagement with the Ragnar question must navigate. And it is terrain that offers no easy passage, no clear path from question to answer, no moment where the evidence resolves into certainty, but there is one more body of evidence that demands our attention before we attempt even a provisional conclusion. It is evidence that was barely available to scholars a generation ago. But that is being generated at an accelerating pace, and that has the potential to reshape the entire debate in ways that none of the existing camps fully anticipated. It is the evidence written not in ink on parchment or carved in runes on stone, but encoded in the one medium that genuinely survives unchanged from the 9th century to the present. The evidence written in human DNA, the genomic revolution that has transformed biology in the 21st century, has reached the Viking Age, with consequences that are still being absorbed by the scholarly community. Ancient DNA analysis, the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from skeletal remains centuries or millennia old, has made it possible to ask questions about the Viking Age that previous generations of scholars could not even formulate, let alone answer. Who were the individuals buried in Viking graves? Where did they come from? Were they related to each other? How genetically diverse were Viking populations? Did the patterns of migration and settlement suggested by the textual sources match the biological evidence? The largest and most significant ancient DNA study of the Viking Age to date was published in the journal Nature in 2020. Led by Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen, the study analyzed the genomes of 442 Viking Age individuals from across the Norse world, Scandinavia, the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, mainland Europe, and beyond. The results challenged several long-held assumptions about the Viking Age and confirmed others. The most striking finding was the genetic diversity of Viking Age populations. The study revealed that individuals buried with Viking cultural markers, Norse-style weapons, Norse-style jewelry, Norse burial practices, were not exclusively of Scandinavian genetic ancestry. Some carried significant proportions of ancestry from the British Isles, from southern Europe, and from other non-Scandinavian sources. Viking identity, the study suggested, was cultural rather than strictly ethnic, a matter of how you lived, who you fought for, and how you were buried, rather than where your ancestors came from. This finding resonated with the textual evidence from the great heathen army sites at Repton and Torksey, where isotope analysis had already suggested a more diverse army composition than the Saga tradition implied. For the Ragnar question, the genomic evidence is not yet decisive, but it is suggestive. Studies of the Ui-Emer dynasty, the descendants of Ivar who ruled Dublin and York for over a century, have the potential, in principle, to establish whether the various individuals attributed to Ragnar's lineage were genuinely related, or whether the genealogical connections are later fabrications. If DNA analysis could demonstrate that individuals identified in the historical record as Ivar's descendants share genetic markers with individuals identified as Halfdan's or Björn's descendants, this would provide powerful circumstantial evidence that the brothers were indeed brothers, and that their shared parentage, whatever the father's name, was a historical reality rather than a literary invention. This work is ongoing. The challenges are formidable. Identifying specific individuals in the archaeological record and matching them to named figures in the historical sources is extraordinarily difficult, requiring the convergence of archaeological context, radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, historical documentation, and genetic data, any one of which can be ambiguous or misleading on its own. False identifications are a constant risk, and the temptation to match spectacular archaeological finds with famous historical figures is a bias that rigorous methodology must constantly guard against. But the trajectory of the science is unmistakable. Each year brings new excavations, new analyses, new genomes sequenced from Viking Age remains. The database grows steadily, and with it, the resolution of the picture it provides. It is not inconceivable that within a generation, an ancient DNA analysis will provide evidence bearing directly on the question of whether the leaders of the great heathen army were biologically related, and if so, in what configuration. Such evidence would not settle the Ragnar question entirely. Even if Ivar and Halfdan were demonstrably brothers, this would not prove that their father was the dragon-slaying, Paris-sacking, snake-pit-defying figure of the sagas, but it would establish one essential link in the chain, the link between the historical sons and a shared father, and it would shift the burden of proof decisively toward those who argue that the fraternal relationship was a later literary invention. The genetic evidence also bears on a dimension of the Ragnar story that the saga tradition treats with remarkable specificity. The claim that Ragnar's sons inherited distinctive physical characteristics from their parents. Sigurd's snake in the eye, as his name implies, was said to have been born with a mark in his eye resembling a serpent encircling the pupil, a feature the saga tradition interprets as a physical sign of his lineage, the dragon slayer's blood manifesting in his grandson's body. Ivar the Boneless, whatever his condition, was described as having a physical abnormality so distinctive that it defined his identity. These are precisely the kinds of claims that modern genetics can, in principle, investigate. Certain genetic conditions, heterochromia, coloboma, various forms of skeletal dysplasia, produce physical characteristics that match the saga descriptions, and the genetic markers for these conditions can be detected in ancient DNA. No such identification has been made. The connection between the saga descriptions and identifiable genetic conditions remains speculative. But the possibility that genetic analysis could provide a bridge between the legendary descriptions and the physical reality of the individuals described is one of the most tantalizing prospects in current Viking studies. It represents a potential convergence of literary analysis and biological science that would have been unthinkable even 20 years ago. There's also the matter of the Scandinavian homeland, the places where the Ragnar tradition locates its protagonist's origins and power base. Denmark, the kingdom most consistently associated with Ragnar in the saga tradition, has been the subject of intensive archaeological investigation in recent decades, and the results have illuminated the political and social context of the mid-9th century in ways that bear directly on the plausibility of the Ragnar legend. The Jelling site in central Jutland, the symbolic heart of the medieval Danish monarchy, has been the subject of a major research program that has revealed a monumental complex of extraordinary scale and sophistication. The famous Jelling stones, the smaller one erected by King Gorm the Old in the mid-10th century in memory of his wife Thyra, the larger one erected by his son Harald Bluetooth around 965 to celebrate the unification of Denmark and the conversion to Christianity, have long been recognized as foundational monuments of Danish national identity, but the surrounding landscape, investigated through excavation and remote sensing, has revealed a larger complex that includes massive ship settings, enormous palisade enclosures, and a monumental burial mound that may predate the stones by several generations. The Jelling dynasty, Gorm, Harald Bluetooth, and their descendants is the dynasty that later genealogical traditions connect to Ragnar through Sigurd's snake in the eye. If this genealogical claim has any historical basis, then the Jelling complex is, in a sense, Ragnar's posthumous domain, the seat of power established by his descendants and maintained for centuries as the center of Danish royal authority. The archaeological evidence shows that the site was already a place of significance before Gorm's time, suggesting a continuity of elite power at Jelling that extends back into the period when Ragnar, if he existed, would have been active. This does not prove the genealogical connection, but it establishes that the political landscape of mid-9th century Denmark was capable of producing figures of the kind that the Ragnar legend describes: powerful kings commanding significant military resources and projecting force across the North Sea. The Trelleborg-type ring fortresses, discovered at multiple sites across Denmark and dating to the late 10th century, provide further evidence of the Danish monarchy's capacity for large-scale military organization. These geometrically precise circular fortifications, identical in design, constructed to a standardized plan using a common unit of measurement, demonstrate a level of centralized authority and logistical capability that would have been essential for the kind of cross-sea military campaigns that the Ragnar legend attributes to its protagonist. While the ring fortresses postdate the Ragnar period by roughly a century, they represent the culmination of a process of political centralization that was already underway in the 9th century. The military infrastructure that could build Trelleborg did not spring into existence overnight. It was the product of generations of institutional development, and the earlier stages of that development would have been contemporary with the events the Ragnar legend describes. The Scandinavian evidence taken together paints a picture of a society that was fully capable of producing a figure like Ragnar, a warrior king of considerable power, commanding fleets of longships and armies of trained warriors projecting force across the North Sea against the kingdoms of England and Francia. This does not mean that such a figure existed. It means that the legend's portrait of its protagonist is historically plausible, that the social, political, and military infrastructure necessary to support the career the sagas describe was present in 9th century Scandinavia. The burden of proof, in other words, does not fall solely on those who argue for Ragnar's historicity. It falls equally on those who argue against it, because the default assumption in the absence of contrary evidence should be that a historically plausible tradition with multiple independent lines of transmission preserves some kernel of historical reality, even if that kernel has been transformed beyond easy recognition. This is not a universally accepted methodological principle. Skeptics would argue that historical plausibility is not the same as historical evidence, and that the absence of contemporary documentation for Ragnar himself, as opposed to the world he supposedly inhabited, remains the single most damning piece of evidence against his historicity. The argument has force, but it also reveals a methodological asymmetry that deserves acknowledgement. We do not demand contemporary documentation for every historical figure of the early medieval period. Many individuals whose existence is accepted without controversy by medieval historians are known exclusively from sources written decades or centuries after their deaths, preserved in traditions that mix historical memory with legendary and hagiographic embellishment. The burden of proof applied to Ragnar is, in practice, higher than the burden applied to many of his contemporaries, and the reason for this higher burden is not that the evidence against him is stronger, but that the legend about him is larger. The very fame that makes Ragnar interesting is what makes scholars suspicious. A figure of such extraordinary stature, the reasoning goes, must be an invention, even because real people are never as extraordinary as their legends suggest. This reasoning is understandable, but not necessarily sound. Real people can be extraordinary. The documented careers of Alfred the Great, of Charlemagne, of the Byzantine Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer demonstrate that historical individuals are capable of deeds that later generations would dismiss as legendary if the contemporary evidence did not survive. The question is not whether extraordinary people exist, but whether the specific extraordinary deeds attributed to Ragnar are credible. And on this question, the evidence is genuinely mixed. The raid on Paris is credible and documented. The military career spanning decades is plausible given the life expectancies and career patterns of the period. The fathering of multiple sons who became prominent Viking leaders is entirely consistent with the polygynous marriage practices of Norse aristocracy. The death in a snake pit is less credible, as it follows a literary pattern found in other Norse and Germanic legends and has no contemporary corroboration. The dragon slaying is obviously mythological. The question is where, on this spectrum from documented fact to transparent myth, the tipping point lies. The point at which the accumulated legendary material overwhelms the historical core and renders the figure irrecoverable. Different scholars place that tipping point in different locations, and their placement reflects not just the evidence, but their disciplinary training, their methodological commitments, and their tolerance for uncertainty. Historians trained in the continental European tradition, accustomed to working with fragmentary sources and comfortable with probabilistic reasoning, tend to place it further toward the historicist end. Literary scholars, trained to analyze narrative construction and sensitive to the ways stories shape and distort the material they contain, tend to place it further toward the skeptical end. Archaeologists, whose evidence is material rather than textual, and who are accustomed to building interpretations from fragments, tend to occupy a middle position, unwilling to dismiss the legend entirely, but unable to confirm it from the physical evidence alone. The disagreement is not a failure of scholarship. It is a reflection of the genuine difficulty of the question and the genuine limitations of the available evidence. The honest scholar, confronting the Ragnar problem, must acknowledge that certainty is not available, that the evidence supports multiple interpretations, that no single interpretation can be definitively excluded, and that the question of Ragnar's existence will remain open until and unless new evidence emerges that is capable of resolving the ambiguity in one direction or the other. Such evidence may be forthcoming. The ongoing revolution in ancient DNA analysis, the continuing excavation of Viking Age sites across Northern Europe and the British Isles, the development of new techniques for analyzing and dating archaeological materials, the possible discovery of new textual sources in archives that have not yet been fully catalogued. Any of these developments could, in principle, produce the decisive piece of evidence that the current record lacks. The identification of a burial that can be plausibly linked to one of Ragnar's sons, combined with DNA analysis establishing familial relationships among the great heathen army's leaders, would constitute the kind of evidence that could shift the scholarly consensus in a way that purely textual arguments have not been able to achieve. Until that day comes, if it comes, the Ragnar question will continue to occupy its unique position in the study of the Viking Age. Not as a solved problem, not as an unsolvable mystery, but as a permanent provocation, a reminder that the past is not a fixed territory that scholars gradually map with increasing precision, but a shifting landscape whose contours change with every new discovery, every new methodology. Every new generation of investigators who bring their own questions and their own assumptions to material that has been interrogated for centuries without yielding a definitive answer. And perhaps there is something fitting in this irresolution. Ragnar Lothbrok, the man who may or may not have existed, has achieved the one thing that the Norse valued above all others. He has been remembered. His name has survived across 12 centuries, through the oral tradition, through the written sagas, through the scholarly debates, through the television screens and cinema halls of the modern world. Whether the man behind the name was a single historical individual, a composite of several, or a purely legendary creation matters less, from the perspective of the culture that produced him, than the fact of the remembering itself. Cattle die, ye kinsmen die, the Havamal says. You yourself will also die, but the word about you will never die, if you win a good reputation. By this measure, the only measure the Norse themselves would have recognized, the question of Ragnar's existence has already been answered. The word about him has not died. It has grown louder with every century, reaching more ears, inspiring more stories, generating more questions than the scalds who first spoke his name could ever have imagined possible. But the word is not the man, and it is the man, or the absence of the man, that we must finally confront as we draw these threads together and attempt to say, with whatever honesty the evidence permits, what we actually know and what we can only guess. The task requires us to hold multiple truths simultaneously, and to resist the narrative urge toward resolution that the saga tradition itself would have found irresistible. It requires us to accept that the most interesting answer to the question, did Ragnar Lothbrok exist, may not be yes or no, but something more difficult, more honest, and ultimately more revealing about the nature of historical knowledge itself. That answer begins with the sons, because the sons are where the legend touches solid ground. And it is from that solid ground, from the documented lives of real men who shaped the history of nations, and that we must build whatever understanding of their father the evidence will support. The sons are the foundation. Everything else is architecture built upon it. Some of it sturdy, some of it ornamental, some of it weight-bearing in ways that are not immediately apparent. To understand what the sons can tell us about the father, we must look not at the broad sweep of their careers, which we have already traced, but at the specific granular details of how they are described in sources close to their own time. Because it is in these details, these small textual fragments preserved almost accidentally in chronicles composed for entirely different purposes, that the ghost of Ragnar comes closest to assuming material form. The Annals of Ulster, recording the death of Imhar in 873, call him Rex Nordmanorum Totius Hiberni et Britanni, King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. This is not a title that a chronicler assigns casually. The Irish monks who maintained the annals were meticulous in their use of royal terminology, distinguishing carefully between local chieftains, regional leaders, and figures who commanded authority across multiple territories. To call a man king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain was to acknowledge a sphere of influence that encompassed the Irish Sea, the kingdoms of the British Isles, and the Norse settlements scattered across both islands. It was, in the context of the 9th century, a claim of almost imperial scope. Now consider what this title implies about the man's origins. A figure who could command the allegiance of Norse communities in both Ireland and Britain was not a minor chieftain who had risen through local raiding. He was a man of established lineage, of recognized authority, of a social standing that preceded and transcended his military achievements. In the hierarchical world of Norse politics, where loyalty flowed along lines of kinship and obligation, a leader of Imhar's scope required a pedigree, a father whose name carried enough weight to secure the initial allegiances that military success could then consolidate. The title does not prove that Imhar's father was a famous king, but it makes the claim considerably more plausible than it would be for a figure of lesser documented stature. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's treatment of the great heathen army's leadership offers a different kind of detail. The Chronicle names Ivar and Halfdan together in its account of the early campaigns, presenting them as co-leaders of the invasion force. It then tracks Halfdan's activities separately after the initial Northumbrian conquest, recording his movement into Mercia, his campaigns against Wessex, and his eventual settlement of Northumbrian land. This pattern, joint leadership followed by independent operation, is consistent with a fraternal partnership of the kind the Saga tradition describes. Brothers who shared a father and a mission might well have cooperated in the early critical phase of the invasion and then pursued separate objectives once the initial goals had been achieved. This is not proof of kinship. Military allies who are not related can also cooperate and then diverge, but the specific pattern matches the Saga account more closely than it matches the alternative hypothesis of unrelated leaders who happen to command the same army. Then there is the matter of timing. The great heathen army arrived in England in 865. Imhar died in 873. Halfdan died in 877. These dates place both men's active careers in a window of roughly 15 to 20 years, from the mid-860s to the late 870s, a span consistent with the careers of men who were of military age in the 860s, which would place their births in the 830s or 840s. If their father was active in the 8410s, old enough to lead the Paris raid in 845, for instance, then the generational arithmetic works. A man born around 810, active as a military leader in the 8410s, could plausibly have fathered sons in the 8310s and 8410s who reached military maturity in the 8610s. The chronology does not prove the connection, but it permits it, which is more than can be said for many of the Saga tradition's more extravagant claims. The Frankish evidence adds one more granular detail. The Annals of Saint-Bertin, describing Regan-Harry's raid on Paris, note that he hanged 111 Frankish prisoners on an island in the Seine. The specificity of that number not many or 100, but precisely 111, suggests that the chronicler had access to detailed information about the event, possibly from survivors or from Frankish officials who negotiated the subsequent ransom. This level of detail makes it more difficult to dismiss Reginheri as a minor figure whose name happened to resemble Ragnar's. A minor raider does not command a fleet of 120 ships, extract 7,000 pounds of silver from the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe, and execute prisoners on a scale calculated for maximum psychological impact. This was a leader of the first rank operating at the highest level of Viking military enterprise. The saga tradition's claim that Ragnar was such a leader is, on this point, entirely consistent with the contemporary evidence. None of these details, individually, is conclusive. Each admits alternative explanations. Together, however, they form a pattern of convergence between the saga tradition's claims and the contemporary record that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The pattern does not prove that the saga Ragnar existed as described. It does not confirm the dragon slaying or the snake pit or the magical trousers, but it establishes something more modest and more important. It establishes that the tradition's core historical claims, a powerful Norse leader active in the mid-9th century, whose sons led the great heathen army to England, are consistent with the available evidence rather than contradicted by it. This is where we must plant our flag, not on the solid ground of certainty, but on the best ground available, the ground of informed probability, of evidence weighed with appropriate skepticism, of conclusions held provisionally and subject to revision as new evidence emerges. The most probable reconstruction, given everything we have examined across the full span of this investigation, runs something like this. There was, in all likelihood, a historical Norse leader named Ragnar who was active in the first half of the 9th century. He was probably, though not certainly, the man the Frankish sources call Reginheri, who led the devastating raid on Paris in 845. He was a figure of sufficient prominence that his name was remembered across multiple cultural traditions, Scandinavian, English, and possibly Irish in the generations following his death. He was probably the father of at least some of the men the saga tradition identifies as his sons. Though whether all of the named sons were actually his biological children, or whether some were attached to his lineage retrospectively, cannot be determined from the current evidence. His death is the great mystery. The Frankish sources suggest that Reginheri died of disease shortly after the Paris raid, which would place his death around 845 to 846. The saga tradition places his death in a Northumbrian snake pit around 865. These accounts cannot both be literally true. The most likely resolution is that the Frankish report is closer to historical reality, that the man who raided Paris died relatively soon afterward, of disease or other causes, and that the snake pit narrative is a later literary creation, a death scene composed to serve the cultural need for a climactic ending to a legendary life. The snake pit may have been borrowed from older Germanic legend, where death by serpents appears as a motif in the stories of Gunnar in the Volsung cycle, a cycle to which the Ragnar legend was explicitly connected through the Aslog genealogy. The borrowing, if it occurred, would have been natural and almost inevitable within a tradition that saw the Ragnar story as a continuation of the Volsung heritage. The vengeance motive for the great heathen army's invasion presents its own puzzle. The contemporary sources do not mention it. The saga tradition insists on it. The most probable reading is that the vengeance narrative is a later interpretive framework, a story that the Norse told about the invasion to make sense of its scale and ferocity, to explain why the sons committed such extraordinary resources to the English campaign when other targets were available. Whether the sons themselves promoted this narrative, or whether it was imposed on their deeds by later storytellers, is impossible to determine. But the possibility that some element of personal motivation, the death of a father, the desire to avenge an injury defeat, contributed to the invasion alongside the strategic and economic factors is not implausible. Viking warfare was always personal. Leaders raided not just for profit, but for honor, reputation, and the satisfaction of blood debts. The complete absence of personal motivation from the great heathen army's calculus would be more surprising in the context of Norse warrior culture than its presence. After Ragnar's death, whenever and however it occurred, the legend began its long process of growth. Poets attached great deeds to his name. Storytellers connected his biography to the Volsung cycle through the Aslaug marriage, elevating his lineage from the merely royal to the mythologically transcendent. The son's documented historical achievements reflected backward onto the father, making him larger in retrospect. The dragon-slaying episode was added, possibly borrowed from the Sigurd tradition, possibly developed independently as an origin story for the Lothbrok byname. The snake pit death scene was composed, complete with the death poem that crystallized the Norse warrior ideal into its most memorable and most quotable form. By the time the sagas were written down in 13th century Iceland, the original Ragnar, the historical chieftain who raided Paris and fathered famous sons, had been so thoroughly absorbed into the legendary composite that he was invisible. He had become what the tradition needed him to be, the perfect Viking, the exemplary life, the man whose biography answered every question the culture asked about what it meant to live and die with honor. This reconstruction is not certainty. It is the best available interpretation of incomplete, contradictory, and deeply problematic evidence. It will be revised as new evidence emerges. It may ultimately be overturned entirely, but it represents, in my judgment, the most honest and most balanced reading of what the sources taken together actually tell us. And it leads to a conclusion that is perhaps more unsettling than either he existed or he didn't. The conclusion is this: the question, did Ragnar Lothbrok exist, is the wrong question. Not because it has no answer, but because its answer, probably in some form, though not in the form the legend describes, is less interesting and less important than the question it obscures. The better question is, what does it mean that a culture created this figure? What does it tell us about the Norse world that its storytelling tradition produced Ragnar Lothbrok, not as a historical record, but as a cultural artifact, a mirror in which an entire civilization saw its own face? The answer, I think, is that Ragnar Lothbrok is the Viking Age's autobiography. He is the story the Norse told about themselves, not about what they did, but about what they valued, what they feared, what they aspired to, and what they knew they would lose. His dragon slaying tells us what they admired, the courage to face impossible odds. His marriages tell us what they respected, women of intelligence, independence, and supernatural perception. His competition with his sons tells us what they feared, the passage of time, the erosion of relevance, the terrible knowledge that the world will continue without you. His death in the snake pit tells us what they believed, that the manner of your ending defines the meaning of your life. That defiance in the face of annihilation is the highest human achievement, that the word about you is the only thing that survives. These are not trivial insights. Won't they utter the deep values of a civilization that shaped the world we live in? A civilization that settled Iceland and Greenland and briefly North America, that founded Dublin and York and Normandy and the Kievan Rus, that gave the English language a quarter of its core vocabulary and the political map of Europe some of its most enduring boundaries. The Ragnar legend is the key to understanding that civilization from the inside, not as a collection of dates and battles and economic transactions, but as a lived human experience, charged with meaning, driven by values, haunted by the same fears and aspirations that haunt every human culture in every period. The sagas understood this. The saga writers were not naive preservers of oral tradition, and they were not sophisticated fabricators of historical fiction. They were something harder to categorize and more important than either. They were the custodians of a culture's self-understanding, the men who took the raw material of memory and shaped it into the stories that would carry that culture's deepest truths across the centuries. They knew that the truth of a story is not the same as the truth of a chronicle. They knew that a man who never existed can be more real than a man who did if the never-existing man embodies something that the culture needs to remember about itself. Ragnar Lothbrok embodies what the Norse needed to remember. And what they needed to remember was not a set of facts, but a set of values. Values that were already under threat when the sagas were composed. And as Iceland submitted to Norwegian royal authority and the independent warrior culture of the Viking Age gave way to the centralized monarchies of medieval Scandinavia. The saga writers were preserving not history but identity. They were writing down the memory of who the Norse had been before the world changed, before Christianity replaced the old gods, before kings replaced the thing assemblies, before written law replaced the law speaker's memory, before the longships rotted on the beaches and the sea roads fell silent. Ragnar's death poem, the Krækumal, contains a line that is often quoted but rarely understood in its full context. "I have fought in 51 battles," the poem declares. The number is specific, almost absurdly so, as if the poet were keeping score, tallying achievements on a ledger of honor. But the specificity is the point. In a world without written records, without institutional memory, without any mechanism for preserving an individual's accomplishments beyond the spoken word, the enumeration of deeds was the only form of accounting that mattered. 51 battles. Each one a line in the ledger, each one a deposit in the only bank that a Norse warrior recognized, the bank of reputation, where the currency was story and the interest was immortality. The modern world has different banks and different currencies. We measure our lives in years rather than battles, in accumulated wealth rather than accumulated honor, in digital records rather than oral poems. Our mechanisms for preserving memory are incomparably more powerful than anything the Norse possessed. Or we can store the entirety of human knowledge on devices that fit in our pockets. We can access the complete text of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Annals of Saint Bertin, the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and the collected works of Saxo Grammaticus from a single screen. We have tools for investigating the past, DNA analysis, isotope chemistry, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, that would have seemed like magic to the most gifted Icelandic scholar of the 13th century. And yet, for all our technological sophistication, for all our methodological rigor, for all the extraordinary advances in our ability to recover and analyze the physical evidence of past lives, we cannot answer a simple question about a man who lived 12 centuries ago. Did he exist? We do not know. We cannot know. Not with certainty. Not with the finality that the question seems to demand. This should humble us. Not because our methods are inadequate, they are the best that human ingenuity has devised, but because the past is vaster and darker than any method can fully illuminate. For every life that was documented, 1,000 were not. For every event that was recorded, 10,000 were not. For every name that survived, 1,000,000 were lost. The written record that we call history is a thin, fragile, wildly unrepresentative sample of human experience, and the confidence with which we navigate it is only possible because we have agreed collectively and often unconsciously to treat the absence of evidence as something other than what it often is, evidence of absence. We do not know what happened. We know what was written down. The distance between those two things is the distance between the shore and the horizon, visible, immense, and impossible to cross. The Norse understood this distance. They lived on its edge, looking out across it every day from the prows of their ships and the doorways of their longhouses. They knew that the sea was larger than the land, that the darkness was larger than the light, that the things unknown outnumbered the things known by a ratio too vast for human calculation. And they responded to this knowledge not with despair, but with defiance, the same defiance that Ragnar shows in the snake pit, the same defiance that Odin shows when he rides out to face the wolf at Ragnarök, the same defiance that is perhaps the most distinctively Norse contribution to the human catalog of responses to mortality and uncertainty. You will die. The gods will die. The world will end. The darkness will swallow everything, but the word about you will not die. If you win a good reputation. Ragnar Lothbrok won the greatest reputation the Viking Age produced. Whether he won it in life or received it as a gift from the storytellers who came after him, the result is the same. 12 centuries after the ships appeared on the eastern horizon of England, 12 centuries after the little piglets came to collect their father's debt, we are still speaking his name. We are still arguing about his existence. We are still telling his story in saga texts and scholarly monographs and television dramas, and in this very moment in the words you are hearing now. The scalds who composed the earliest verses about Ragnar, whoever he was, whatever he did, would have understood this perfectly. They would have recognized it as exactly what their art was designed to achieve. The point was never to record facts. The point was to create something that would survive, something that would outlast the flesh, outlast the bone, outlast the ship and the sword and the longhouse, outlast the language itself as it evolved from Old Norse into the Scandinavian tongues of the modern world. The point was to build out of nothing more durable than breath and memory, a monument that time could not destroy. They succeeded. By any measure, across any distance of time and transformation, they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. The story they built has survived the fall of the civilization that created it. It has survived conversion, colonization, appropriation, and misinterpretation. It has survived translation into languages that did not exist when the first verse was composed. It has survived the transition from oral to written to digital media, each transition threatening to strip it of its context and its meaning, each transition instead revealing new dimensions that previous audiences could not have perceived. The story endures because it is about something that endures, not Viking history, not 9th century politics, not the economic factors behind Scandinavian expansion. These are the contexts that scholars rightly insist upon, the frameworks without which the legend becomes fantasy. But the legend endures because it speaks to something beneath and beyond its historical context, something about the human relationship with death, with time, with the terrible knowledge that all things end and the fierce, irrational, magnificent refusal to let that knowledge be the last word. Ragnar in the Snake Pit is not just a Viking in a dungeon. He is every person who has ever faced the certainty of their own ending and chosen to meet it with their eyes open and their voice raised. His death poem is not just a piece of medieval Icelandic literature. It is an assertion, as raw and as necessary now as it was when it was first composed, that the human spirit is capable of something that transcends its material circumstances, that a man or a woman facing annihilation can still choose how they face it, can still wring meaning from the senseless, can still compose a song in the darkness. This is what the Norse gave us. Not the horned helmets, not the berserker rage, not the one-eyed god or the rainbow bridge or the eight-legged horse. These are the trappings, the decorations on the hull. What they gave us was the conviction that meaning must be made, not found, that in a universe that offers no inherent purpose, the making of story, the winning of reputation, the creation of something that outlasts the creator is the only answer to oblivion that human beings have ever devised. And at the center of that conviction, still, after all these centuries, sits a man who may never have existed, smiling in a pit of serpents, composing his death poem, knowing that somewhere his sons are sharpening their swords and his enemies are about to learn the cost of killing a man whose story cannot die. The venom rises. The verses flow. The man becomes the myth, becomes the meaning. And the meaning, unlike the man, is real. It is as real as the North Sea wind that carried the longships to England on that gray morning in 865. As real as the sound of iron keels grinding onto an East Anglian beach, as real as the silence that fell over York when its walls were breached and its kings lay dead in the streets, as real as the language you speak, seeded with Norse words that crossed the ocean in the mouths of warriors and survived 1,000 years of use to reach you here now in this moment. The old boar suffered, the little piglets grunted, and the world we live in, this world of English words and Scandinavian place names, of parliamentary democracy descended from thing assemblies, of stories told in the darkness against the certainty of dawn. This world is the sound of that grunting, still echoing. He's still carrying the weight of everything the Vikings built and everything they destroyed, still asking the question that the Saga tradition always asked and never answered. Was he real? Listen to the wind. Listen to the words it carries. Listen to the 12 centuries of voices, each one adding a verse to the poem, each one insisting that the story matters, that the name must not be forgotten, that somewhere beneath the layers of legend and the silence of the sources, a man lived and fought and died and was remembered. The evidence will not give you certainty. The sources will not resolve into a single clear portrait. The bones in the ground, if they are ever found, will answer some questions and raise others. The DNA, if it ever speaks, will speak in probabilities rather than declarations. But the story is complete. It has been complete since the first scald spoke Ragnar's name over a fire in a smoky hall, since the first listener leaned forward to hear what the old boar said as the serpents closed around him, since the first child heard the words and carried them forward into a future that the scald could not see and the child could not yet imagine. The story is the evidence, not of what happened, but of what mattered, and what mattered to the people who made this legend and to the people who have carried it across a millennium is this, that a human life lived fully and ended bravely is worth remembering, that the word about you is the only part of you that the darkness cannot take, that the little piglets will always grunt when they learn what the old boar suffered, and that some stories once begun do not end.